Emily, could you take us online?
We tend to do that a lot, don't we?
You know about architecture. I had a high school girlfriend. That's Dinkle. It's amazing. It's like contacts.
So everybody, are we online, Emily? Okay, let's go ahead and call the meeting back to order. And we're doing pretty well. We only have two things to accomplish today left. And Chairman Harshman left me in charge. We'll see if that was a wise idea or not. But we have agenda item number 12, government tax exemptions, and then we have skill-based amusement games. So both of them we have to get done before we go. And with that, we will start with government tax exemptions. Bill Draft 23 LSO 0066. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh Anderson, LSO. So this bill, 23 LSO 66, you've already seen this interim. It was this item came before the committee a few years ago. The committee came out with a very similar bill, although with then a different piece that was added into it on top of kind of this idea of clarifying what a governmental purpose is. So you saw this bill again in September, and then it was carried over to this meeting. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess the overall purpose of this bill is, and as we'll see as we get into this, currently in statute, there are several different ways that governmental purpose is defined. So federal government, state government, counties, municipalities, and schools are all exempt of their property is exempt if it's being used primarily for a governmental purpose, but how that's defined in statute is different for each of those or not defined. So the idea of this bill was to establish a definition. So you'll see that on page 2, where used primarily for a governmental purpose is defined to mean that the majority of the property is used for health, safety and welfare, education, transportation, infrastructure, or administrative purposes, and a lot of those are defined later in this bill. Then it goes on to say that used primarily for a governmental purpose does not include property owned by a governmental entity acting in its proprietary capacity, and shall not include any of the following. Then we have a list of things that are not included as governmental purpose, including property used for recreation, including cabin rentals, campgrounds, bowling alleys, movie theaters, shooting ranges, property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, including airplane hangars leased for private use, property used for commercial operations, housing for employees, land for agricultural or other use, land under privately owned structures, medical clinics operated by a private entity, and school buildings that are no longer used for a governmental purpose, idle government property, including vacant land and vacant structures, unless the entity is required to hold that property by law, and government property held for sale or lease. Then we have some definitions of what administrative use does include, which is administration of the government, including state capitol, courthouses, city hall buildings. I have definition of education, which is public schools, colleges, universities, school buildings, administrative buildings, bus barns, art facilities, libraries. Health, safety, and welfare. You'll see a long list of things that can be included in there, Mr. Chairman. Infrastructure on page 5, which can be parks, public grounds, alleys, sidewalks, cemeteries, golf courses. And then transportation, which is roads, streets, interstates, construction and maintenance, operation and repair facilities, aviation facilities, public buses, rights of way that are dedicated to the public. So on to page 6, Mr. Chairman, and you can see here in the deleted language kind of how it was previously defined, so property owned by the United States, and then there was a list that is being repealed of things that did not include a governmental purpose. Same thing for property of the state. You'll see paragraph 3 is not included there. That was for counties, and that currently just says property owned and used primarily for a governmental purpose without any definition of what that might be. You'll see school districts primarily for a governmental purpose, excluding teacherages, and then property of cities, and you'll see there where it's stricken including, there was in a list of items that were considered to be used for governmental purpose. Page 7, you'll see the repealer and the effective date, which is made effective January 1 of 2024. That's the bill, Mr. Chairman. I take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Questions for Mr. Anderson? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you look at the repealer on what currently is not a governmental purpose. So there's these 4 things that are listed: improvements, A, B, C, and D. Did those bear any bearing on what you listed as not bearing a governmental purpose at the start of this bill? Because there doesn't seem to be a lot of overlap in what we're repealing is not a governmental purpose and what you put in here. And that was always been kind of one of my, it's not clear to me how this plays out. Is there going to be more property taxes paid net or less? And nobody can answer that.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, yeah, I think the intent overall when this bill was drafted, and again, this was a few years ago, was just to provide clarity as to what is and is not taxed. Where before there was some confusion between different types of government. Whether there's any net change in that, I think it would in part depend on, what type of government entity you're talking about and how the counties are currently interpreted. So some of the assessors here may be able to provide a more clear answer on that. But I think overall, just the intent was, here's a more clear definition of really what we mean here. And there's certainly policy choices in there, and certainly the purview of this committee to change any or all of those.
Go ahead, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The one other thing, though, I wanted to get in a little is the 4 things currently listed as not a governmental purpose are very different than what's listed in this bill. Did you use those at all? I'll read one of them: improvements in equipment rented, leased, loaned, or furnished by the state to employees or groups of employees, ... Where you did a more concrete deal, which I think is good, but did you look at that at all? The what's previously listed, and did you decide to move in a different direction? That's my main question. Thank you.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, again, this bill is the same as it was, several years ago, and I don't recall exactly where all of this language came from, but I do believe, we did try to consider, what the current law said as well, or says, as well as kind of the practices among the counties. And I believe Director Henson had at the time done a survey of the counties, and that's where some of this information came from.
Yeah, and Mr. Anderson, by way of structure, it's kind of, it goes into this section 3911-105, which is a list of exemptions, and it repeals most of those exemptions, but it has, for most of them, it has more specificity in how it's defined earlier. But we might hear from others about how the bill is constructed as well. So anybody else have a question for Mr. Anderson on this bill? Thanks, Josh. Hang tight. How about, would the Department of Revenue come visit with us? Where's your entourage? That's good. And thank you, Director Henson, for being here. And I'm kind of sorry about the 2 days scheduling to get you back on both days, but appreciate it.
It's okay.
Okay, to you.
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. I sincerely appreciate this committee taking time again to look at governmental exemptions. This was an interim topic in 2019. Seems like just a couple years ago, but
does.
2019 is when we really delve into governmental exemptions, and there was quite a bit of testimony that was taken. But part of the problems, just initially, and I've done a couple of presentations that really got into the weeds, but I'm not going to do that today. Big sigh of relief for everyone. What I'm going to
Everybody, let's
focus
just do
on,
it.
including the audience. But what I do want to remind everyone is prior to 1955, our Constitution for Wyoming indicated that everything owned by the government was exempt from property taxation. However, in 1955, the voters of the state added the words primarily used for a governmental purpose. Obviously, there was an intent behind that. Unfortunately, in 2022, we still have not clearly defined what is deemed used for a governmental purpose. So that's why we are here again today. And during those years, as you know, the role of government has really changed. What we ask, whether it's the state, counties, cities, towns, what we're asking them to do for the residents of Wyoming has changed. It's broadened, it's expanded. We no longer really think of government just doing health, safety, public welfare type things, roads, streets, those types of things. So with that comes a review of our current statute structure. And to Representative Gray's point, we've got in one section of the statute where under cities and towns and under the state of Wyoming, our law basically, instead of saying what is a governmental purpose, it tells us, well, this is not a governmental purpose. Well, for someone administering the law, does that mean that if it's not on this list, it absolutely is a governmental purpose? Because on the other hand, for county governments, it just says used primarily for a governmental purpose. So there aren't even any, roads of guidance for county assessors on deeming which is taxable, which is not. The other thing that an assessor has to consider is that for governmental entities, the presumption legally is that it's exempt from taxation, and it's up to the assessor to prove that it's taxable. And so because of this, most legal counsel, I have been told, will provide legal guidance to the assessor of, we just don't have enough clarity. There's not enough case law out there for us to go ahead and overcome that presumption. So because of that, you may have assessors out there that don't tax something. Then you've got an assessor with the exact same type of property that looks at it and says, oh, clearly that shooting range is not a governmental purpose, and so I'm going to tax it, or that golf course. But yet in the county down the road, they've exempted it. And we have this situation where it forces governmental entities into litigation to find out the answer in the end. And I don't know about you, but I don't want my taxpayer dollars being spent on litigation between governing entities. So what is a better remedy is that we have a law that specifically tells the assessor, these are the things that meet that criteria of used primarily for a governmental purpose. If it isn't that, then it should be taxable. We're not saying that the government can't provide that structure or that for this type of a service. We're just saying it's not exempt from property taxation. And we have a lot of governmental owned property. I'll use one example just to get us kind of down this mindset. We had a small town in Wyoming who their constituents wanted them to open a daycare. And so that small town, to meet the needs of that town, opened a daycare and felt that that daycare should be exempt from taxation. Well, that case had to go to court. And we were told that daycares are not a governmental purpose and that they have to pay taxes. Now, they didn't have to shut down the daycare. They just had to pay taxes, just like any other daycare down the street. And so just don't want you to read too much into this. It is not far-reaching outside of the property tax realm. It's just simply, do they pay taxes or not? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I hope I have laid the groundwork.
I think you have. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is, under this bill, would a daycare be taxable? Would a daycare that was owned by a city be taxable?
It would-
Director Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, it definitely would depend on the structure. If it were leased to a private entity and just funded by the government, I believe that this document states that it would be taxable. And then also, it does go into, I think in the details here, it does indicate, I think it would be taxable all along with this new language. And I apologize, I've not read the new language. And it was the bill from the
2019
interim. But it would be taxable because it's not
A governmental purpose.
governmental, correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, what was the, can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What was the fact pattern in that daycare case? Where did they lease it out to somebody or did the city do it on their own?
Mr.
Do you
Chairman,
remember?
in that case, I believe, fortunately, we have the county assessor in the room that was
Yeah, it was Laramie County.
correct. And they can definitely share the details of that case more articulate than I can,
It's involved with the city of Pine Bluffs.
correct.
And I believe it was litigated to the Supreme Court. So go ahead. Anybody else? Representative Schuler.
I'm gonna have to go to the House. I keep getting called Representative Schuler. I
I
really,
just do that?
I do like the House members though, so. Anyway, it's okay, really. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, I'm so sorry. I
It's all
don't know.
right.
I really apologize.
I go wherever I'm told.
And I've done this for 2 years, and so you're gonna be rid of me, so it'll be
It's
okay.
okay. No worries.
Thank
I
you.
just have a question on page 3, and if this was asked while I was out of the room, I apologize. The idle government property, which includes vacant land, vacant structures, could you give me an example of what would cause a government entity to be required to hold a property by law?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schuler, that came from a litigation. And so under our statutes, it has been deemed that the schools are required to own property. And then, so they will purchase vacant land and they'll hold it until the funding becomes available to actually build that school. We had litigation in that a school district owned property for several years, and it appeared that they were not going to build a school on it, and it was placed on the tax rolls by the county assessor, and the courts said that the law requires them to own that property. Now, if you are a county, there's no law that requires you to purchase and own land for a future purpose. So in those instances, it would be taxable under this bill and under current case law.
Thank you.
Was that another Laramie County case?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Wow, you guys are litigation minded here.
But I will say that even though Laramie County is the one that takes that litigation and ends up going to court over that, it does provide guidance for the rest of the state. The problem is it's so narrowly focused on the issue at hand that it does not answer all the questions that we're coming to you today for to make those policy decisions at the legislative level.
And who was the assessor in Laramie County during a lot of that litigation? That must have been one hardcore person.
It was that Brenda Arnold.
Oh, different name. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr.
Anybody else have a question? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on page 2, which is the beginning of the laundry list, under the definitions portion. So I'm still trying to contemplate you know, up on line 6, it basically says used primarily for a governmental purpose, primarily. So then down to line 20, B, property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, including airplane hangars, leased for private use, property use for commercial operations, housing employees. So let's say, which my recollection in some of the previous testimony, the actual terminal itself was brought up in a question on, is that used primarily for governmental purpose, which I would say yes. But then it was sorted out, the little coffee kiosk or operation that they've leased out. In the case of Natrona County, they haven't been able to find anybody to lease it. Then at one point we had a restaurant. Now we don't have a restaurant. Under these premises, then you've got also Avis, the rental car agencies at Natrona County. How am I to determine whether their little portion then becomes taxable?
Director Arnold.
Mr.
Director Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney. So the first step is to determine ownership. Okay, so you're talking about the structure itself and the land underneath it. So those items, if it's primarily used for a governmental purpose as defined by the statute, then, and primarily means over 50%, primarily its main use, then it would be exempt from taxation. All of the personal property, furniture, fixtures, equipment, chairs, tables, those are typically owned by the business. So the governmental exemption does not, is not applicable to property that's not owned by the governmental entity, even though it's housed within real property that is owned by the governmental entity. So that's kind of where that breaks out. As far as another example, it's not airport related. The state of Wyoming purchased the Pioneer Building here locally. A portion of that building housed state agencies. A portion of that building already, when it was purchased, had leased out floors to private sector, and it was an income producing situation. Until that building met that criteria of primarily being used for a governmental purpose, the entire structure was taxable, and the state of Wyoming paid taxes on that building. But once the scale turned and it tipped to be where the primary use was for governmental purpose, then it was exempt from taxation. But that's the way it was administered in Laramie County. I cannot tell you that that's how it would have been administered in all 23 counties. And so that's why this bill is so important.
Anybody else? Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Henson, on page 2, subsection A, should golf courses be included in that, or is that just covered by used for recreation?
Director Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, that's what's nice about this bill. That's a policy decision. If you wish to include golf courses, then I would include them. Any of the items, this bill is a starting point. And so I would encourage this body to really look at everything in this bill. And if you don't believe that they should be exempt from taxation, remove them. If there are other governmental uses that you believe should be included, let's add them.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Yan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So under infrastructure on page 5, golf courses are defined as infrastructure, which is exempt as a governmental purpose because it's included in the definition for use for governmental purpose.
There you go. Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I guess mine's just a hypothetical of history. It seems to me like that we need the clarification. It having to do with uniformity across the state. It just seems like a very long time from 50s to now to get to the point where it seems like somebody that was getting taxed on the airplane hangar, maybe in Lander or somewhere, didn't go to court and say, well, if this was in my community or Sheridan, it would be, was that going on in all those years in between? Because it seems to me like that this clarification is necessary to have uniformity. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yes. Director Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, absolutely. As stated, county assessors across the state have, a governmental entity purchases a property. The assessor has a deed. As soon as they get that deed that says this, City of Sheridan has purchased a property, their first step is they send out an exemption application to the City of Sheridan to find out what's their anticipated use. And as soon as they get that application back, then legally the assessor has to make a choice. I either grant the exemption or I deny the exemption. And then when I send them the assessment schedule, they have the right to appeal that. So what happens is there becomes this give and take. And then we decide whether it actually gets litigated or not. And does the assessor change their mind? Does legal counsel tell them, no, I don't think we have enough case law? And again, it goes back to this expanded economic development's a big one in this realm of things, where government has kind of gotten into the development business in certain instances. Should they be taxable or should they be exempt? But do you want it to fall on the 23 elected assessors and their legal counsel to make that determination? Because once it's exempted, it doesn't get litigated. We never hear that challenge. And so I'm hopeful that we can clarify.
Go ahead.
Director, it seems like that you would have heard a legal challenge, though, from the competition in the next county. It seems like there'd have been some kickback there.
Go ahead, Director Henson. There might be something about standing in some of those circumstances.
Well,
you can help us with.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Jennings, so a hot topic for the legislature historically has been government competition in private sector. And to that end, we had some legislation historically that created this place on the governor's, it's the governor's, or maybe it's Secretary of State's, I apologize, I can't remember which website, but there's a place out there where private sector can go out and say, I am concerned about this entity down the street that is a governmental entity, and they're providing the same services that I am as a private citizen. And they're not paying taxes. Their cost of doing business is less than mine is, because I'm having to pay taxes on my equipment, my furniture, my fixtures, my building, my land. And so I'm concerned about that. Unfortunately, it's just an exchange of information. It's not a litigation. There's no appeal there. I can appeal my property value, but I can't appeal the town of Lingle's assessment. That's their legal ability. So while I totally recognize where the point of your comment, Representative Jennings, it would just be something that the assessor would listen to, but really has no authority to do anything about it in a neighboring county.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Thank you,
Thank you,
Director
Mr.
Henson.
Chairman.
Stay close. Who else would like to address us on this bill? How about our fine? I think you had a little too much help yesterday, if you want my opinion. Welcome, assessors.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Dixie Huxtable, Converse County Assessor, and I brought that infamous Laramie County Assessor with me to the table, since he has some firsthand experience about governmental exemptions. A couple of comments I'd mentioned yesterday that we had put out a survey, and there was unanimous support for this bill in a couple of cases. There was a lot of comments, but specifically defining governmental purpose had everybody's vote. Which one of the laundry list you choose to make exempt and not exempt, there's no action. That's a tax policy, and they may have had a personal opinion, but they didn't have a vote on that. But getting all levels of government at the same definition of governmental purpose so that we could become uniform across the state had everybody's vote. So I wanted to make clear that you knew that we can come together on something sometimes, and not always, but sometimes. In regards to the bill specifically, and then I'll let Assessor Gill speak. As I said, used primarily as a governmental purpose, getting that defined is very valuable, not just for us, but for all of our constituents, because we do get the conversation about why is that not taxed? An example I have in my county is a governmental medical building. I have a private doctor that pays for his medical building and all of his equipment, but all the doctors that are in the medical building owned by the hospital, as part of the hospital, is a different story. So those things evolve over time. The example of a bowling alley, you'll see that name in here, and that seems kind of odd. Why are we talking about a bowling alley? You have a municipality or a town in this state that owns and operates a bowling alley. But the other bowling alleys in the state, not even in the same county, they want to know, why do they have to pay taxes? We're providing an recreation for our people. Why are we? And I'm an avid bowler, so I hear that pretty often. So we'll take that with a grain of salt. But there are those questions that come to us, and we deal with them in our own jurisdiction, but we don't have any leeway to go outside of our jurisdiction. I think that there will be some cases come. I think there are some already docketed to the state board involving governmental property being taxed. I think there are some coming from a few of the counties on the western side of the state. A couple of points in the language that's in this bill, and we're just going to give a couple of examples of why there's a conflict. On page 2, starting at line 16, where it says the property used for recreation, including cabin rentals, campgrounds, bowling alleys, movie theaters, etc. Those are all considered not governmental purpose, so those would be taxable. But if you go to page 5 of this bill, over to, these is a laundry list of things that are considered governmental purpose, you will find fair buildings and fairgrounds. You have quite a few fairgrounds around the states now that have camping that they collect not just during an event, like the county fair, they collect year round. And my esteemed colleague is one of those that had to put that property on the tax roll. Not every county assessor's done that, because as Director Hinson said, we get legal advice from the person who has to represent us in these cases that says, we're not going to take that battle on. So that is one example. Another one is the parks, the property for parks that is exempt, but what if your park has the cabin or the campground? So you've got a county park that offers recreation, but it has the cabin. So those are a couple of things in here that you guys get that fun job of deciding that tax policy, what is and was not. And truly, the assessors, honestly, I believe, have no opinion what should or should not be. We're just going to give you the cases that are out there, so you can make that informed decision. And then I would stand for any questions.
Okay, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Huxtable, I think maybe inadvertently, you're almost arguing against this bill, not directly, but I mean, you're arguing all these nuances. And in a way, that's an argument to keep it with you, because I think just looking through this, you're gonna have conflicts. I mean, at one point, it says fair buildings and fairgrounds are not taxable, but then when you look at it for sports complexes, I think you'd argue that it is in the things that are taxable. And then, you go community event centers, including civic centers and recreation centers. Well, that could be a sports complex in certain situations. I mean, I think you're kind of the same thing with golf courses. I mean, so it is listed as not taxable, but again, you go back to sports complexes and property used for recreation. I mean, I think, so I think,
I think that's exactly what she's saying, though. She's saying there's a disconnect.
no, I think what she's saying is that every assessor is doing it differently. But the problem is, once you get into this definition, is that you really can't define it because all these nuances that she's laying out are going to conflict and create different situations. So you're still going to get it litigated, I think, because there are going to be fairgrounds with with a campground on there. Well, this bill doesn't give any clarity on that unless we change it. But I'm just saying, more I think about this, I mean, I don't know where I stand on it yet, but I think there is an argument to keep it with the assessors for a variety of reasons, because you can parse through the nuance.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. And you might talk about universality or consistency.
Representative Gray, that is exactly why the assessors are asking for this direction, is because we have been accused of doing 23 different things and not having any uniformity across the state. And it's for a variety of reasons, but mostly because there is no definition. So if you chose in this bill to move the campgrounds and make them not taxable, we'll administer that. We're okay with that. But you've put it into the law. If you don't change this and you don't put them in here, then you are absolutely leaving it up to 23 county assessors along with their 23 boards of commission and their 23 attorneys to make that call. And I guarantee you it will not be uniform across the state. So anything that we can do to get it clear or more clear is helpful to everybody. And truly the most important portion of this bill, honestly, for us, is getting them all the same. So that you're treating them, whether you make the fairgrounds exempt or not, if you treat whether it's owned by the state or owned by the county the same, at least we have the same grounds that we're fighting on. We're not looking at this list to say that it's inclusive, but this one's not. So that portion of that bill is really, really important to us. We believe that that's really a really important thing, to be consistent and have uniformity across I hope I answered your question.
Go ahead.
What I'm saying is no matter what, you're not going to have uniformity because you're going to have all these nuances that are going to conflict in the statute. That's all I'm saying. But I know Representative Yin, I have a couple more questions, but we'll go ahead and let Representative Yin go and then I'll come back to me. Thanks.
That's kind of you. Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Assessor Huxtable, I don't want to pick on you, but I try to have this zoom out view of what we're actually doing with this bill, right? And it just reminds me of the presentation that Director Henson gave where it creates a tax spiral. So we're taxing government to take from government, which ends up getting redistributed just to other parts of government, including the same hand that got pulled out. So it does in some ways still feel like for anything that we haven't defined as a governmental purpose, we're creating bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake, which really truly seems very silly. And so maybe some of the clarity is, as a tax policy, maybe it really should just be everything that a government can legally do is a governmental purpose, because otherwise it wouldn't be given that statutory power to do those things, right? Because if it has that power, it is a purpose given to the government that the government is enacting, whether it's owning property or et cetera. So I guess to wrap that up as a question is, would it be more clear if we didn't just have this laundry list of things, if we just basically said a bit simpler that things that are owned by the government and run by the government are part of a governmental purpose? And maybe a secondary question to that is, I know we have these exceptions for US government property as well. Do we have any US government on our tax rolls in Wyoming?
Mr.
Assessor
Chairman,
Huxtable.
Representative Yin, to start with the first one, the spiral effect that you were talking about with the property taxes. If it's a tax policy of this group to make everything that's owned by government that's legally to be done, and you put that into law, we'll administer that. We're okay with that. We're not here to say what we think should or should not be exempt. What we're saying is, you tell us if it's okay to be exempt, and we'll exempt it, and we'll do it uniformly across the board. We really do not want to get into the laundry list to tell you what we think should or should not. You will hear about that yourselves and the government will hear about that from the private businesses that are competing with those people that are paying taxes compared to the thing that the government decides to do, legally can do, and you make exempt. But if we do that, and if you make that decision, we will administer it and probably feel a big sigh of relief, because we at least know what we're supposed to be exempting and what we're not. As far as, do we have anything in the federal government? I can't speak to that for every county. I can speak to my county. I do not. I probably have some property that should, as in a cabin that might be on federal land that I don't know who owns the cabin because there's no record of it. So I should be taxing the government, but I'm not really sure who to send the tax bill to. Just like the state land, which brings me to page 3 of your bill, leased land for agricultural or other use. Should all state land that's being leased for agricultural purpose be taxed? I can tell you right now, it is not in the state of Wyoming. I know of no assessors that are taxing state-owned land that's being used for agriculture, but this bill might lead to the fact that it would be taxed. Again, I asked a question to somebody earlier, who do I send the bill to? Send the bill to Governor Gordon. I'm not sure. And that's honestly one of the reasons why some of this stuff is not taxed. I truly believe there is some federal stuff that should be, but I don't know that they have I think the BLM might be getting some tax bills, but I don't know the details of those. So I apologize on that, but.
And let's be clear, I think your testimony was you support the definition, property used for a governmental purpose. That means a lot to the assessors. And then you qualified and said, the devil's in the details about the laundry list. So I think you've been pretty fair. So we get to set the laundry list. Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I don't want to be Machiavellian, but I don't see much government in a bowling alley. And I have a hard time just because it happens. I mean, we have bowling alleys on the bays, right? They're privately owned and operated, really. I mean, they lease the structure. They pay an amount to have their food trucks out there. But we still tax them for some of what their stuff. On their trailer, there's a license plate that we get money for. So I almost think it'd be easier to define the governmental purposes the other way, what's not governmental. And I'm just offering that as an alternative to consider. What do you think?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Representative Henderson, I'm good with that too. I'll take whichever way you want to go with this. Just give us the direction to say, this is not a governmental purpose, or everything they own is a governmental purpose, and let's go down that road. I can't, since this is the assessor from your esteemed county that can talk about that bowling alley, I would have him answer that question.
Okay, anybody else for, just a quick follow-up. Go ahead, got a follow-up?
Thank you. I mean, and the other piece of this is the unknown amount of, frankly, you know, pretty good size of revenue, I believe, across the state that we're not getting benefit of for the people of Wyoming. I mean, there's a lot that we're turning a blind eye to, not intentionally, I'm sure, that we're not getting benefit of. And frankly, particularly in the rural areas, this could be a big boost, I think, in some of their cost issues or their needs, meeting their needs, financial needs, if we would find a way to automate this process, make it simpler, define it, automate it, and then have the assessors play more of a, you know, an adjudicator, you know, local expert role to decide. And then we could give you the authority, you know, within your office, and then you could bring in whatever talent's necessary. But that, to me, would be a better objective than to have a whole litany of bowling alleys and movie theaters, whatever government wants to get involved in, because it has government involvement, it's not taxed. I just think we're doing ourselves an unintended disservice. What do you think?
Well, Assessor Huxtable.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, not sure what I think about all that. That was a lot of information. I guess ultimately, right now, it is the assessor's decision, the way that the current law is, and we do make that call. And then there is the appeal process for those that want to appeal. So the way it is now, we do make that decision whether it's taxable or not. Whether we're leaving tax dollars on the table or not is a different discussion to have, but we are making the call. The point that we're trying to make is that there's 23 different people making 23 different calls. And we would like the support or to know what your tax policy is, which way, what should we be doing? If you're happy with us all being different, then that's great. But we just feel like there needs to be, and truthfully, the court cases that we've had have indicated that there's some ambiguity, and that's where I bring Ken in, because he is our guy that takes on this. He has a lot more activity in Laramie County than we do in some of the other counties, so he gets to be the
How about if we hear from Assessor Gill? Okay.
I think this is a brief, yes or no, or if possible. Do you think this is going to lead to more governmental taxation on governmental held properties or less across the state? Just from your judgment, what you see with the other counties. I mean, is the government going to be paying more or less on the properties that it owns?
Direct, Assessor Huxtable.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know statewide. I can't answer that question. The way it is narrow, the way the bill is now, there's still some questions. So in my county, I think that there would be some more property that would come on the tax roll, AKA all the ag lease land would come on the tax roll. So my county, yes.
Director or Assessor Huxtable, do you think that this bill could lead to more uniformity in tax treatment across the state of Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, I would hope so. That was what we were hoping for, is that there'd be some uniformity. And I think at one point, sir, if I may, there was discussion about let's put everything up on the wall and let's start peeling off what we want. And we've never got to that point of peeling everything off. This is the start. This is kind of what was found in the survey that Director Hinson mentioned of all the assessors of what's out there, what's going on. I can't predict everything that's going to happen in the future, but this is what we know has happened. And we just are asking for some guidance on what we should be doing with it. And if you're happy with what we've been doing with it, we'll keep status quo.
Do taxpayers ever complain to assessors, and on your own experience, that you're taxing me for this, but down in Niobrara County, they don't tax for the same thing? Do you ever hear complaints like that?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we do. We do get some of those. I've not had a lot of them. I anticipate a few more because there's some more cases coming up where assessors have denied the exemption. So I think that will spread further across the state. We do get a few that come in and say, why are they not paying taxes down there? Similar to, I have a house just like my brother's in another county and his taxes are different. So we usually, I can speak for myself, I can't speak for everybody else. This is what I do in Converse County. This is how I interpret the law. What that county does, I can't speak to. That's the answer that comes out.
That's a great answer. Do you ever get complaints of this kind of nature, that someone will come in and say, you know, I have this lease building and the tenant, and I have to pay property tax on it, and the so-and-so government entity also leases a building to someone that has the same type of activity and they don't pay taxes on it? Do you ever get complaints like that? And that might be a bad example, but cases where people that are taxed are complaining about entities not being taxed.
Mr. Chairman, I do have that example exactly in my county.
Let's hear
I have
it.
a city hall that moved many years ago. The old city hall sat vacant and they were leasing it out. They had one city employee over there because they didn't have room for him in the new building. So they were leasing out the rest of the old building for meetings as a commercial meeting space. I had a local person that was trying to compete with that, who was trying to lease out meeting space and came and asked why. Brought the radar to my attention. That old city hall went back on the tax rolls. I had thought they'd kept enough offices in there to keep it going. The taxpayer had a valid question. Why are they not paying taxes, but they're making a profit off of offices and they're not using it as a government office anymore? But I'm doing the same thing and you're taxing me. That city hall went on the tax roll. It is still on the tax roll.
Okay, thank you for that. So everybody, I think the point that's happening here is that this bill may not have the right list, but we'll get to the right list over time, and we'll make this bill better. But there are real issues here between how things are taxed and how they're not. So maybe if it's okay, we should go to Assessor Gill, who could enlighten us on how wonderful things work in Laramie County.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Ken Gill, Laramie County Assessor. Not a lot to add, and absolutely the assessors will work with you to whittle down this list or expand this list, whatever we need to do. So we will work with you on that. A few answers. Representative Gray asked about the daycare case that went to the Supreme Court. It actually went twice to the Supreme Court. The first case was they did not appeal, and they called it an illegal assessment. So they did not exhaust their administrative hearing. So that's one that went there. Then the second one, everything went through the County Board of Equalization, State Board of Equalization, District Court, and Supreme Court. And yes, the town was running the daycare and was operating in competition with the daycare down the street. So that, just to answer your question on that.
Okay, go ahead, Representative Gray.
Mr. Chairman, so, the way I read this is I think that governmental competition, if this passed, would not be taxed because it wasn't being leased out. Whereas in the case you had, the Supreme Court came to what I believe is the correct conclusion, that they are in competition with the private sector and therefore they should be on an equitable standpoint. So I guess my question is, do you agree with that? And then, the challenge is, I don't know how to get that language right, except put daycares in the list. That you could do that. I guess that's the answer.
Go ahead,
Mr. Chairman,
Assessor Gill.
Representative Gray, I think you're right. I'm not positive that it would be taxable or not at this point. I haven't really studied this, super close, but that is the reason that they decided that way, because they were competing with private business.
Well, everybody, let's just go back to the definition now. All these lists are used to kind of illustrate the definition, but the definition of used primarily for a governmental purpose means that a majority of the property is used for health, safety, and welfare, education, transportation, infrastructure, or administrative purposes of a governmental entity. Used primarily for a governmental purpose shall not include property owned by a governmental entity acting in its proprietary capacity and used to conduct activities that are frequently carried on through private enterprises. And then it has a list, and shall not include the following. And so a daycare, certainly plenty of private alternatives to a daycare. I think you still have the daycare coming under this issue. It may not be in the list, or it may be in the list, or, but all of the lists are used to say what's in and what's out of the governmental purpose. It may not be the best approach, but I think it's clear for people, and they can argue about it, but it is. I'm not sure why, folks that care about limited government should care that we define it so that we decide whether to tax it or not when private entities compete with it. I hope we could agree on that. Go ahead.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would certainly agree with your tenet. What I would say, though, is unless you put it in the list, it's going to be is a daycare then a governmental entity acting in its proprietary capacity? I'm just gonna argue about that. They're gonna relitigate it. We put it in the list, and that's, I think, an amendment, but I'm skeptical this is really gonna answer many of the questions. But, one thing I will say that was a good lesson, I think, from the Supreme Court case was that even though there were some things in the list that are not taxable, they didn't use that as an exhaustive list.
No.
That's probably something we should just flat out say here, that this is not an exhaustive
agree.
list.
I think that's a good suggestion.
So,
Okay. Representative Sweeney.
Before Assessor Huxtable leaves, I'm a little confused by part of your testimony, which is nothing new for me. So I understood on page 2 that this was the list of basically exempt properties the way I read it, but in your conversation back to page 2, I'm hearing, unless I misunderstood, that from line 15 down on page 2, and then it goes on, those are actually not exempt.
Go ahead.
Mr.
Assessor
Chairman, Representative Sweeney, sorry for any confusion I created. On page 2, I believe, starting at line 14, that is another definition of administrative use, which I believe with this bill would be exempt. The list that I was referring to was the top, or excuse me, I was talking about page 3. You were talking about page 2, correct? Okay, so I interpret this bill, and if I'm wrong, certainly correct me, is that they are providing a laundry list or trying to provide a list of those items that are not exempt. So they are not acting as a governmental purpose. That's the way I read this bill to be read from starting on page 2, line 16. This list of things is the way this bill is written, is that these would not be exempt. They would be taxable, and goes all the way over to page 3, line 12.
Through D,
Pardon me?
through subsection D.
Correct.
So everybody, just to be clear, we're working in the definition section here.
Correct.
So definition, Romanet 18, used primarily for a government purpose means blah. And it says down below, it says shall not include the following A, B, C, D. That's all part of the definition of used primarily for a governmental purpose. Then we have a new definition, which is Romanet 19, I guess. Is that what that is? Yeah. Pretty good. Administrative use means this. So the list under administrative use and the list under government, not a governmental purpose, are two different lists. They're completely different. And they just relate back to the definitions. And so when the court rules, they're going to say you tried to define governmental purpose, you gave some examples, and you said this and you gave some examples. And you tried to define administrative use, this is what you said. You tried to define education, this is what you said. So have I done okay? And health, safety, and welfare has a sublist too. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, J, K, M, N, O. And then infrastructure has its own definition. So it's mostly in the definitions here. Ms. Huxtable, I'm going to give you a chance to correct me.
Mr. Chairman, no, I believe that is correct, that this is just in the definitions, and they are providing a list under the definition of used for primarily for a government purpose, and there is a laundry list of what shall not be included or be considered governmental purpose, primarily for governmental purpose.
And Ms. Henson, you think we got that right? Okay, thank you.
Could I have a follow-up?
You bet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have a real problem after testimony we've heard from the airport operators. And now with that better clarification, thank you for that. now we're saying property on line 20, property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, including airplane hangars leased for private use. We heard in testimony that that's the way it's set up by the federal government on appropriate uses, that you can't actually, I don't know if they actually own the hangar. They never own the land underneath it, is my understanding. And this could affect majorly some of the federal funding sources to our airports. If this is included, it was my understanding. And the airport operators produced a possible amendment the last time we worked this, but that hasn't been included, that would satisfy the FAA. But I may be understanding this correctly, but incorrectly, but I'm gonna be a no vote if we can't get something resolved here for some of this. And I totally agree that in some communities, a bowling alley is the only form of recreation and the only way it can survive, just like Hogan on Casper Mountain, the ski slope. The city took it over. They don't want to be in that industry, but nobody else has been able to make that work. So I bring that back to the bowling alley example, but so anyway.
Mr. Chairman.
Assessor Huxtable.
Representative Sweeney, I think you're absolutely correct. The way I read this language, those would be taxable as far as the airplane hangars that you're talking about. That is not our wish. That's not what we are supporting. Whether you, as a tax policy, make them exempt or taxable, whatever you want to add or remove from these lists, we're okay with. We're not advocating one way or the other. We're just saying, make a decision one way or the other, and then we'll administer it. Because otherwise you've got a variety of things going on. So I believe you're correct that the way this is worded, that type of property would become taxable according to this language. Please understand, we are not advocating, the assessors are not saying, please make them taxable. We're just saying, define it one way or the other. We're just saying, if you want to leave it in there, fine. If you don't want to leave it in there, take it out. We're good with that.
Just a couple of points. Remember, we're just talking about property taxes,
Mhm.
which I'm sorry, despite the discussion yesterday, they're pretty modest, all in all. So if your business plan can't squeeze out the property taxes, maybe something's not quite right. In my airport in Lander, we lease a hangar and we pay property taxes on it. The city itself owns hangars, which it leases out. And I don't know if the city pays, if that city-owned hangar is on the tax rolls or not. But it's not much different than if I put up a private hangar and lease it out. So the FBO that's in the city hangar competes with an FBO that is in a private hangar, and clearly the private hangar pays the property taxes. Now, is that fair? And I think we should be happy to accommodate the airport operators if they have a reasonable amendment. I don't see one in front of us, but we got plenty of time to amend this through the session. If we kill the bill now, we don't have a tool. So I don't think this is a finished piece of work, but it's a start. Representative Jennings and Representative Baldwin. Senator Baldwin. And then
I work with her.
Queen Schuler.
Well, welcome back to the House. Representatives, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have just I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like, and I don't know if it's for the assessors or the director or Joshua. Page 4, but then it's on through the entire thing. It says, line 3, health, safety, and welfare includes without limitations. And that's got commas on each side of that. So could we get just a little bit of what that without limitations might mean?
Go ahead.
I definitely defer to Josh.
Yeah, Josh, why don't you give it?
Sure thing, Mr. Chairman. Representative Jennings, yeah, so that is, language is intended to indicate that that's not an exclusive list.
Yeah,
So-
go back to you, Representative Jennings.
So, Mr. Chairman, so in keeping with the conversation earlier where we were talking about needing to put that this might not be an exhaustive list, would this cover that?
Josh?
So, Mr. Chairman, that's for the specific definition of health, safety, and welfare. I think the question was whether we needed something like that on the definition of what is not considered being used for primarily a governmental purpose on page 2. And so inserting some sort of that type of language there might address that, Mr. Chairman.
And just to be clear, Josh and Representative Jennings, and that's with the negative list, right? So it's on line 14, and shall not include without limitation any of the following is kind of what a similar amendment would be. But it would be the negative list where the other one's a positive list. Is that right? We're good. So that could be in a possible amendment. Senator Baldwin,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
welcome to
Senator Case.
Senate.
Just a couple of quick points. Number one, I know earlier we talked about an airport operator that was online available to us. You may be able to give us some clarification,
Yeah.
Mr. Brubaker from Rock Springs. Secondly, the bowling alley and theater owned by a municipality are in my district, and the theater happens to be in competition with my theater. I haven't complained yet. I don't think I will.
It's probably not going to be good for your image. Anybody else? Okay, anything else for either of these two? Did you guys have anything else?
Mr. Chairman, no, I just wanted to remind everyone that the list we were talking about at the bottom of 2 and the top of page 3 is those things that are not exempt but are taxable. So I would just ask you to look at that language because it includes land leased for agricultural or other use.
That is
biggie.
definitely a big one.
That is a biggie. That's all.
Okay, thank you guys very much. Thank you. Who else would like to address the committee on this bill? I know the taxpayers do. Let's hear from Wham, and then let's hear from Sherilyn. Okay, we'll put you first. Ms. Kaiser.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for stepping in. I'm Sherilyn Kaiser, and I represent the Wyoming.
Pull it
Airports-
closer, you're very
the Wyoming
soft-spoken.
Airports Coalition.
Uh-huh.
And Devin Brubaker is online and would like to testify. He has a meeting. He's been waiting to testify. He has a meeting at 3 o'clock. So if we could take his testimony, I sure would appreciate it.
I think we could do that. Do you have his? Okay, Mr. Brubaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to stay up here or? Okay. Mr. Brubaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Sherilyn, for getting me on the screen here. I appreciate the opportunity to testify remotely. Mr. Chairman and committee members, my name is Devin Brubaker. I'm the airport director for the Southwest Wyoming Regional Airport in Rock Springs. I stand before you today representing all the airports in the state of Wyoming as part of the Wyoming Airports Coalition. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you. I have a few comments. Hopefully to be as quick as possible here. The Wyoming Airports Coalition wholeheartedly supports the idea of defining governmental purpose. We recognize the need to have conformity across the state. Unfortunately, this draft of legislation includes language that would interfere with our ability to comply with several FAA grant assurances, including FAA Grant Assurance 24, fee and rental structure, and the most significant one, Grant Assurance number 25, airport revenues. The FAA's revenue use policy strictly prohibits the use of revenue for fees or taxes that exceed the value of services received by the airport. Most airports perform their own road maintenance, plowing operations, streetlight repairs, and in our case here in Rock Springs, we even operate and maintain our own water and sewer systems. Therefore, the taxation of airport land and facilities would most likely be seen by the FAA as revenue diversion, making our state's airports ineligible for tens of millions of dollars of annual federal grants. Furthermore, the draft legislation states that governmental purpose shall not include property owned by a governmental entity acting in its proprietary capacity by conducting activities that are frequently carried on through private enterprises. In Wyoming, there are 42 public use airports, of which 40 are owned and operated by governmental entities. 40 out of the 42 appears to show that the ownership and operation of an airport is frequently conducted by a governmental entity. Across the United States, there are currently 3,331 public use airports in the FAA's National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. All but 75, or 2% of them, are owned by governmental entities. Once again, 98% of all public use airports being owned by a governmental entity prove that the owning and operating of an airport is not frequently carried on through private enterprise. While it is common for private enterprises or individuals to construct their own hangar or facilities upon airport-owned land, it is very uncommon for those improvements to be leased out, as most airports include provisions in their lease agreements that do not allow for subletting. Nearly every aircraft hangar that is leased to private individuals or enterprises in the state is owned by a governmental entity. Owning, operating, and leasing aircraft hangar space is a common governmental activity. This legislation represents a situation where tax dollars would be chasing tax dollars, as 37 of 42 public use airports in Wyoming are not financially self-sustaining and utilize local government subsidies. For those few airports that are not self-sustaining, it would dramatically alter their ability to generate operating revenue necessary to remain self-sustaining. The complexities of airports are unparalleled when it comes to land use. This legislation does not factor in the following unique characteristics of airports. Airports can lease facilities for private development, but we are unable to sell them due to FAA Grant Assurance number 31. Land leases for private development are required to have reversion clauses that convey the ownership of the improvements back to the airport at the end of the lease period. Currently, it is understood that privately owned improvements, hangars, warehouses, etc., are assessed to the owners of the improvements. However, land underneath those improvements are not. This legislation would make all land under privately owned structures taxable. Airports in our state have hundreds of privately owned improvements on airport-owned land. All of that land would be subject to property tax under this legislation. Also, the language does not make it clear who would be responsible for the assessment on the land, the airport or the tenant. We charge fair market rent on those facilities, which means if we have to pay taxes assessed to the land, we would have to lease those facilities at a lower cost. And if the taxes are assessed to the tenants, they would only be willing to pay lower rent. In either case, it would be a form of revenue diversion, which is expressly prohibited by the federal government. The legislation would also make all airport-owned property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity for private use taxable. This would make the commercial portions of the terminal building taxable, including our car rental and airline facilities. Those additional costs certainly won't help us attract and maintain air service. This would also be applicable to aircraft hangars and other improvements on our property that we own, which here in Rock Springs is 67 different facilities. The current draft legislation does not provide a grandfathering clause for existing leases, meaning that airports with long-term leases could be liable for the cost of property taxes until such time an existing lease expires and the rate can be adjusted to avoid the increased financial burden of the airport. Mr. Chairman, we did provide some draft amendments at the last committee meeting where this bill had died previously. We would be happy to represent those amendments that would address our concerns with this bill. However, we also would be okay with a direction Representative Yin brought up that would basically say that anything that's legally allowed to be done by a governmental entity is a governmental purpose. Airports are very unique. We have a lot of challenges that face us in rural Wyoming. This bill would make those challenges even more difficult for us. So if this bill were to continue, we do have a series of amendments that I could share with you right now, and that would correct those issues. But I think it sounds like from the assessor's perspective, this bill truly needs quite a bit more work. And I know this is your last meeting of the interim, and I don't know what your timeline is to be able to have all those amendments taken into consideration. So I will defer to you, Mr. Chairman, if you would like me to provide those amendments to you right now.
Thank you, Mr. Brubaker. I think we'll get you some questions. I think you might be confused though, because I think you might be interpreting this wrong. And so I'd kind of like to also get a reaction from the assessors and the Department of Revenue, because I don't see where this says that if someone privately owns something, they have to pay taxes on the land underneath. So I think you're reaching on a couple of these, but we would be happy to look at your amendments. And I would hope you would share the FFA grant assurance requirements that you listed quite quickly with the committee. We will work with you. We don't want to impinge any federal funding, but I do think you might be misinterpreting this bill and going a little bit too far. So I will say that as a preface, and we'll get folks up to try to answer some questions. In the meantime, let's hear from other members of the committee. Who's going to, maybe you both could come up. Go ahead. Representative Gray's got a question for you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I'm a basic guy, but it does seem like that an airport would be subject to that property tax. So, I mean, is there anything where you pay property tax on at your airport, or is it just all exempt? It's just what it sounded like, kind of been the position. And is that uniform across the state? Because, I mean, it does appear that it is a commercial purpose done by government, and therefore it would be, it's not used primarily for a governmental purpose. So my question is, what is the status quo? Do you pay any property tax on your operations there? Thank you.
Mr. Brubaker.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, appreciate the question. Here in Rock Springs, we do not pay any property taxes. The airport itself and the city of Rock Springs own every facility on our property. We have no private development on our airport. We own all land and all facilities. In terms of statewide, it is to the assessor's point, it is not handled the same in every community. I know in Park County, some facilities are taxed there, but this bill would drastically change that for us. We are federally required to hold on to certain lands to protect.
Sir, I'm not sure that it would change anything. We're going to try to figure that out, honestly. I think you're making an assumption about the change. I'd like to hear from the assessor and the Department of Revenue. How would this change things for airports, potentially? You see the impact that everything would become taxable like he's talking about?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not really sure I was following 100% of what the question and the issue is. From my perspective, if the land is owned by the county and they are leasing the entire land out to a leasee, then in a proprietary business, then that land and the buildings would be taxable. However, if the county owns the land and there's a privately owned hangar that they allow to pay a lease to have it sit there, the owner of the building of the hangar pays the taxes on the hangar, but not on the land.
That's what I'm thinking.
And I don't see that this changes that, other than if they're leasing those buildings out to an entity, then it becomes taxable. If they're operating it themselves, they being the government, then it would still stay exempt. That's the way I'm interpreting the way this is written. I brought Director Hinson with me as support, but that's the way I'm reading this. It's only the buildings or the infrastructure and or the land that's being leased out to somebody else that would possibly become taxable based on this language.
Director Henson, do you kind of agree?
Mr. Chairman, yes, and I particularly appreciate your pointing out that when we define governmental purpose, it's identified on page 2, lines 6 through 14, where we say, this is what is a governmental purpose, and then the definition. So if you go to the word transportation on line 8, that's where you go back to the definitions to define transportation, which includes aviation facilities. If you go to education, we define education. So we go through what is used primarily for a governmental purpose, and then we provide clarification via the definitions. So hopefully it's easy to follow if you're a taxpayer and a governmental entity. That being said, it really is the purview of this body to determine what is used primarily for governmental use. And to Representative Yen's statement, if this body wants to say everything owned by a governmental entity and being used in illegal use, which I don't know what an illegal use unless you're, I don't want to go there. But my point is, we've really come full circle back to everything owned by government is primarily used for a governmental purpose, which for some reason, back in 1955, the people of this state didn't think that was appropriate.
Let's go
And I-
back to Mr. Brubaker for a second. So Mr. Brubaker, what I think I'm hearing from this testimony in front of me is that your situation at your airport wouldn't change at all. There would be no new tax obligation based on the situation you described. So I'm trying to keep from people throwing a line in the sand and wanting to fight about something that's not relevant, because you guys are very powerful. We care about our airports buku in Wyoming, and we don't want to screw things up. But I don't see where this causes you more taxes. So
Mr.
I'm hoping we could move away from asserting that it does and try to figure out exactly where those problem instances are.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the clarification. I would be happy once again to provide our amendments that address those, but I would call your attention to page, I believe it's page 3. I hope I'm operating off the same draft you all are, but on page 3, it's under subsection B. On page 3 towards the top, it talks about land under privately owned structures. And while I just told this committee that we do not own, or there is no privately owned facilities on our airport in Rock Springs,
Bingo.
many of our airports in the state do have privately owned structures on airport land. And that is one of our amendments, is to delete that language out of there, because the land owned under privately owned structure, or land under privately owned structures, would become taxable based on the language of this bill. Furthermore, there's language in here regarding agriculturally held land that airports, if you look at Casper, Natrona County International Airport, they have immense amounts of land that they're required to hold by the federal government. And they either have to pay to maintain those lands or they lease them out for agricultural uses, which is a compatible land use dictated by the FAA to protect the approach surfaces of our runways. So those are just some small examples, but we do have amendments. We thought this bill had died at the last meeting, so I apologize that these amendments were not back in front of you today. We once again support the idea of defining governmental use, but we do have serious concerns with many provisions of this bill. We'd be happy to communicate those in writing once again to you all. I really think this bill needs quite a bit more work that isn't going to be able to be done during a session, is just my opinion. And I would encourage the committee at this time to see this bill maybe come back next interim, where we can all work together as stakeholders to formalize this list.
Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may ask the director and maybe the assessor, between, on pages 2 and 3, between capital B, capital C, and capital D, where it's talking about governmental property, well, land that has property on it used for commercial stuff, land that's idle, land that's used for ag leases, land that's used for leases for business parks or economic development. Would this cover every parcel of state trust land with those three, and saying that they are not exempt from governmental, from taxation?
Director Hanson, did you get it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yen, I believe they would become taxable under this language.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, does
Representative
that,
Yen.
thank you. So the Kelly parcel, which is an idle piece of government land, the county would assess a tax to the state of Wyoming for, if this bill has that,
Potentially.
like it is.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. It would be typically
Agriculture.
absolutely what it's being used. It would be valued as agricultural, but in most governmental leases, almost all of them that I've ever seen have a provision in them that state that the lessee is responsible. Yes, the lessee is responsible for any taxes. So what we end up doing is, City of Cheyenne in care of Joe Smith, and Joe Smith pays the tax.
But Mr. Chairman,
Representative Yan.
so, but for the ones that don't have leases on them, the state would end up paying property tax on those pieces of vacant land.
I don't think if it's leased, they'd have to, if it's not leased, I don't.
It's
think
not
they-
leased.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it is leased, they'd have to pay taxes. If it's leased for the purpose, I think right. And I think the agricultural land from state lands is a big question, fair enough. But if it's not leased, I don't see how it would pay taxes.
So in capital C, I don't think we are required by law to hold that property, and it would be idle land.
Let's hear what Assessor Huxtable, because she might be correcting me here.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yen, I am showing you section C, which is what Representative Yen just mentioned. As
I was talking to you, you're saying cut it off.
No, a C, property that's vacant land and being held, and not being required to be held, which that would be an argument for the legal eagles, but absolutely,
Yeah.
I would agree with Director Henson. I would see as this language now that potentially all of it would be taxable,
As agriculture?
whatever its use is.
Mhm. Yeah,
Correct. If it's not ag use currently, it would be some other
well,
classification.
that might be good for Teton County.
I waive that question.
All right, any further questions for Mr. Brubaker? And Mr. Brubaker, have you been able to supply us with those amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I will send those to you here in just the next few minutes.
That'd be great.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Sweeney.
I brought a copy from the September meeting.
Okay.
And just asked Josh to see if those were the same. I've also checked with another person in the room that identified those as the same amendments from our September meeting. So I think at this point, Josh is trying to run copies so we
Okay.
can distribute.
Let's
It's the same bill.
hang loose, Mr. Brubaker.
Same.
Hang around until we get those back.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Brubaker? He does have a meeting at 3. 2:59. Well, I hope you trust Representative Sweeney to run your amendments for you.
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely do, and I appreciate the opportunity. If I was not the chair of this next meeting, I would stick around, but I am the chair of our local economic development group, and I need to run that meeting. So
Sure, and
I-
could you
I
send those FAA requirements for grant assurance that you were talking about, 24, 25, 31, and the other relevant ones?
yes, Mr. Chairman, that will take a little bit more time. I'll have to dig those up and get those over, but I'll be happy to get those over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your next meeting.
Thank you.
All right. Who else would like to address the committee? Mr. Fraser? Which mayor did you bring? That's the right answer. Go ahead, Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the time. For the
Is your
record,
mic on? And is it pull it close?
it's green. Do I need to pull it closer?
Please.
For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I have Mayor Kelly Krakow here with me. To my left, Mayor of Town of Albin and Chairman of WAM's Legislative Leadership Committee, among whatever dozens of other hats he wears. So recently on the Tonight Show, Jimmy Fallon asked viewers to send in stories about camping trips. And one viewer wrote in and said our family was sitting around the campfire singing Kumbaya when the ranger came by and asked that we hold it down or at least choose another song. So today I'm choosing another song. I'm not here to sing Kumbaya today. WAM opposes the bill. I think everyone in the room agrees that there's a lot about this version that would need work before we're ready for prime time. I would argue that the bill is unnecessary. We oppose it primarily on the basis that we oppose having to charge taxes to pay taxes. I believe if this bill were passed, the taxpayers of Wyoming would pay more taxes because local governments would have to charge taxes to pay taxes. I think the state might have to charge more taxes to pay their taxes that would fall under this. So that's the primary reason we oppose this. Having said that, I'm a little surprised. Well, let me first deliver some bad news. For those that aren't aware, Wyoming's 23 counties are not the same. And so this need for uniformity across the state, sounds tantamount to the Wyoming legislature saying, hey, our tax structure is different than a lot of the other 50 states. So let's ask the federal government to just send us a checklist so we don't have to think so hard and create our own tax structure. I think there's a good reason why some judgment is given to the county assessors. I agree it would be easier for them if they just had a checklist and they didn't have to exercise any judgment. But there's a good reason why they're given that. And the reason is the one size does not fit all. Our 23 counties are very different. Now, having said that, it's no secret to this committee that several of our member municipalities have disagreed, even very recently, with their assessors. Some of those grievances, unfortunately, were aired at one of your recent meetings held up in Lander. Some of those grievances were aired. Having said that, I don't anticipate that going forward that our members would always agree with their county's assessor. However, there are several layers of appeal currently in place so that when those disagreements take place, they can appeal to the County Board of Equalization, the State Board of Equalization, if necessary, the courts. And I think that's okay. I mean, and occasionally, even after those appeals, I could cite you some examples of even after those appeals where our members still don't agree with what the assessor decided. Nevertheless, I think that taking that, taking their decision-making responsibilities away from them and putting them in statute really takes away the ability to address really the disparate needs of our 23 counties. Further, as has been adequately illustrated here today, there's a lot of devil in these details. And even if you were able to, which I'm pessimistic about, but even if you were able to create these perfect lists of inclusions and exclusions, I'm not sure how long it would be before those lists would be obsolete. And you can say, well, we just come back and add things or delete things at that time, but you guys have all seen, you legislators have all seen, as have we, example after example of where we're looking at a statute that's long since become obsolete. So I think that even if you could create the perfect lists, which again, I'm pessimistic that could be done, even with a lot of work. I think that you would be looking at obsolescence. Maybe sooner, maybe later, but certainly probably a prolonged period of obsolescence before it was updated. So I have several concerns with the language of this bill as well. I probably rather than go through them, I probably would wait and address those if this bill goes forward. But again, I think there's very good reasons why those kind of judgment calls are left to the counties. And again, even though we don't always agree with them, we don't always agree with what happens at the legislature either. But we're 100% behind your duty and responsibility to make those decisions. And by the same token, I ask you, even though they're asking for you to make their jobs easier, I'm asking you not to take that decision-making responsibility away from the county assessors. With that, I'd take any questions you have, unless Mayor
Questions for
Craycott
Mr.
wanted
Fraser?
to add.
Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Frazier, Mayor Kirkhow. So, we spent the morning twice talking about creating livable communities. So I was wondering if you or the mayor could help explain why a governmental entity would decide to make a campground or a bowling alley or a community center or a Parks and Rec center. What are the reasons that a local government would do that?
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yen, I think this
Would you do your
bill,
name again and introduce yourself?
sorry,
Thanks.
Mayor Kelly Craco, Town of Albin. And Mr. Chairman, and like I said, I think especially if you leave this up to the county assessors, there's going to be a lot of gray area because you take Cheyenne, Casper, the bigger cities, a bowling alley is probably going against the private sector. However, you take small towns like Albin, LaGrange, or Burns, there's a lot of them that don't have this. Our purpose, and if we did decide to do a bowling alley, instead of having kids going out and breaking windows and doing graffiti and all this stuff, if you can give them something to do, that's going to help your government purpose. Some of the other issues I got against the private sector, I'm all against not being against the private sector. But look at the town of Albin. We do our own mowing. There's landscaping services. We blow our sprinklers out. We do our own trash. We get a break on the trash truck on the plates and that. There's other garbage collectors. Is that going against the private?
So is that taxed under this bill? Are those activities taxed under this bill?
Well, some of them could be.
I don't think so.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Go ahead.
I guess the question is, would it make it harder to do these things that the market in your tiny community would not be able to pull off in the private sector if we ended up taxing the creation of you being able to make a more livable community for Albin?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Representative, through the chair. You raise a good point, and there is kind of the undercurrent of the private sector, public sector competing with the private sector and having an unfair advantage in doing so. Again, I think this is where the local decision-making at the assessor's office would be helpful, because there are communities, government ought to do what the private sector either can't or won't do. If that's why we do things like, sewers and streets and, things that aren't going to pencil for the private sector. There's a reason why there's those governmental purposes. Now, Cheyenne is very different from Albin, even in the same county. And there may be something like some of the examples that you used, that a smaller community, if the community did it, and I've lived in communities even, that I won't get into too many examples, but anyway, there may be something in a smaller community that in a larger community, the private sector would, be all over and take care of. But if not for the help of the local government, just wouldn't happen in a smaller community. And I think that folks in our small communities deserve to have some of those quality of life things. And if that's what they ask their local government to do, I think their local government should be responsive. Having said that, the county assessor has the opportunity to make a judgment about, is this competing with the private sector? And if it is, then they have the ability right now to declare it taxable. If they make a finding that it is not, and it's a public a quality of life issue that the local government is taking care of, that would not be provided to their constituents, but for their involvement, the assessor might make a different decision. Again, back to my original, one of my original thoughts, which is that I think that the uniformity, statewide uniformity, is being overblown here. I think we're not uniform, and just like Wyoming is not uniform with all the other states, each of the counties in Wyoming are not uniform with each other. Some are very different than each other. And that's why presently the assessors have that that judgment-making ability. And again, even though I don't always, even though our members won't always agree with the judgments they make, I think that, I think we need to let them have that judgment.
Questions for the gentleman? Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the
Who
time,
else
Mr.
would like to
Chairman.
address us on this bill? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Josh Hannes with the Wyoming Hospital Association. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not here to argue for or against the bill. I understand where it's coming from and the concept. I just want to focus concern on just one area as it
Let's hear it.
identifies workforce housing essentially as a non-governmental purpose. And speaking only for hospitals and for my members, is that some of our members have identified this as a way to keep workforce in their community. So you're really dealing with either inventory of housing. So I just looked quickly in the Census Bureau in 2021 says that vacancy across the state of Wyoming was about 1.2%. So there's not a lot of inventory if you're trying to recruit people in and bring them in, excuse me, bring them in. The other is affordability. So some communities might not have adequate housing for if you're bringing in nurses or lower paid staff. We also use them often for traveling nurses. They come for 13 weeks. There's not a lot of options in communities. We don't want to, excuse me, we don't want to compete with the private market. And we've had hospitals who owned housing and have since let them go for whatever reason. So this isn't something we want to do. None of my members would come in here and say we want to be a landlord, right? So I would just ask that if this were to move forward, that our hospitals who are governmental entities continue to have this ability to provide workforce housing and not be taxed on it as they currently are in most communities.
Questions for the gentleman? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate that clarification because I think our hospital in Natrona County, one of our hospitals, has kind of the same situation as other communities, but I want to focus on another part of this that I am looking for a little bit of clarification in your mind. So there are some non-memorial, county memorial hospitals in our state. We now have 2 in our community. And as you read this bill, one for sure is owned by a non-for-profit company. And I'm not sure the ownership entity of the other. Do you read that they are now taxable under this, or would they remain exempt?
Go ahead if you can.
Mr.
I
Chairman.
don't think that was your testimony, but
Representative Sweeney, I would have to double check for sure. I believe that the other hospitals created a nonprofit holding company that has ownership of that building. So I don't believe that this bill would change their situation, but I'd have to investigate a little further.
any other questions? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My understanding is that most hospitals, when they do this, they don't charge rent for the traveling nurses, just provided gratis. And, but I'm concerned, it seems from your comments, they do charge rent in some situations. So, I mean, if they're charging rent, then I think it's definitely a proprietary purpose. And it should not be exempt. Now, if they are not, then I think that's a little more of a gray area. But are you saying that if a hospital is charging rent for housing for their workforce, that you think that that is exempt?
Or should be, I guess. Go ahead, back to you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, yes, I do. They're solving a problem that's not being solved elsewhere in the market. If it's being solved, if they don't have to do it, they're not going to do it.
I'm coming at this as well. And I do know that the private sector is pretty good at providing housing, by and large. They do a really pretty good job. They build apartments, they build homes, and, they do a good job. It may be expensive in a place like Teton County, where I know the hospital has, I think I've heard as many as like 12 hospitals or 12 houses for doctors and other people. And Representative, you might know better, but that's quite a few. So the nonprofit hospital, and it is a memorial hospital there, would have bought these properties, and they would have paid a astoundingly big chunk of money for those properties in Teton County, unless somebody gifted to them, and that's possible to provide. But the property tax liability that might be on a piece of property is just a fraction of the other costs of the property. It's de minimis, really. It's way less than 1/100th of the value of the property on the assessment roll. So I'm like, a hospital's going to go to a lot of effort to buy a $500,000 piece of property in Teton County so that they could provide lower rents, but still going to charge rents for doctors that live there or other people. And then they're going to fight about the property tax, which is going to be fairly de minimis. I know it's Teton County and it's not tiny, but, and if they were to just pay a private developer, that developer would have to pay the property tax. So I'm having a little trouble with the magnitude here. So help me with that. It seems de minimis to me in terms of everything.
Chairman Case, I don't know, right? What, depending on what county you're in, what you would pay, and depending on the scale of the investment you've made and the property you own. That's not at all my point. What this bill is arguing is that creating workforce housing is not part of their purpose. And I'm arguing that some places have determined that it is, that it's the only way to solve the problem of having people come into their community and provide care. Whether it's what percentage of the property that they own, I mean, we'd have to look at that and go and see. But what I'm saying is that we are saying it is it is part of their purpose. I'm only speaking for hospitals, that we need this to bring into their community. They've made those investments. And to be added to be basically establishing a new tax for these entities, we don't think is correct.
Do you know if any of these hospitals actually pay a private entity to provide the housing, and then they can sublease essentially to their medical people to use them? Do they do that?
Could you repeat the question on the screen?
So, I mean, one model is to have the hospital own the house, or the hospital could just lease the house and then sublease it to the, if they do charge rent to the doctor, they could do that. And the private entity, they could choose to pay less than it costs them to rent the house. They wouldn't have all that obligation of having the house. And the owner of the house would pay the property taxes in that instance, clearly. So it's a different model, and you could get to the same result and not have to buy a house.
Sure, Chairman Case. I'm happy to look into what our different hospitals are doing, what models they're pursuing. Maybe that's happening some places. And I guess I'll say again, and not to repeat myself, is if they own these properties and they're essentially a landlord, that's because that's the option that best suited that environment at that time. They don't want to do this. None of my members would come in here and say, this was the best thing we ever came up with, and this is what we want to do. But they had to do it because there weren't those other options. I'm happy to look into the specifics of who's doing what, but this is not they're not happy about doing this if that's the situation they're in.
And you know, I can imagine if you were a hospital foundation and you owned houses in Teton County, that actually might be a pretty good investment for your foundation funds. And I wonder if that's part of the mix. How about you, Representative Yin? You got any questions?
Mr. Chairman, no, I really did want to point out that we heard the story about the one senior who lives in a house and their property tax quadrupled. So when we're talking about something where hospital is looking for long-term housing that's sustainable, if it means their property tax on all those properties are also going to quadruple, it will no longer become de minimis when it comes to property taxes.
But remember, Representative Yin, that poor lady doesn't want to sell her house. She's not owning it as a real estate investment. That's the last thing on her mind. If a hospital in Teton County has a portfolio of 12 houses, and one of them comes up for sale, and wow, they suddenly sold it for twice what they paid it for it before, that can make you excuse a lot of property tax that you could have paid over the years. So it's a little different situation than that old lady, because they have a foundation and they're seeking returns on that foundation. One of the returns might come from owning property in Teton County, which seems to be a pretty good deal. I think we're mixing things up here and making this more complicated. Okay, who else has questions for the gentleman? Thank you. Who else would like to testify on the bill? Anybody online like to testify on the bill? Okay, committee, we've heard testimony. What's your pleasure? Motion by Baldwin, second by Jennings. Discussion. Any amendments? Go ahead. Who's got it? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask on, basically, you can see the different portions. This is the same identical bill that we saw in September. These are the same proposed amendments that the airport operators had given. I'm unfortunately a paper guy. It's the only thing I know. You can look at my book, 3-ring binder. And so, yes, I saved some of these things. I don't know how else to do stuff. So I had this on file. And so you can read through page 2, lines 20 through 23 would be delete entirely. Going to page 3, lines 1 through 4, delete entirely. In page 3, lines 10 through 12, that section, delete entirely. And also on page 3, line 16, after courthouses, insert housing for employees. And then again, page 3, line 18, insert a new paragraph and renumber as necessary. Aviation facilities means real property and improvements owned municipalities, counties, joint powers boards, special districts, airport boards, either singularly or jointly for the purposes of exercising powers in 10.5.101. That would be all of the amendments.
Is there a second? Who gave the second? Yin? Okay, I would hope we would divide the amendment, go through these individually. Is that acceptable? Okay, so the first one would be deleting page 2, lines 20 through 23. That seems to stand alone, and lines 1 through 4, that's included. So that's the first division. And so that's page 2 and page 3. So I understand this comes from the airport owners or airport operators, but the baby's sort of being thrown out with the bathwater on this one, if you look at it, because the word airplane hangars is included on line 21, but it's about a lot of other things than airports. Property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, and including airplane hangars leased for private use. Remember, somebody privately is in there. That's why it's there. Property used for commercial operations, whatever that might be. Housing for employees, regardless of whether a fee is charged. I guess to your point, Representative Gray. Land lease for agricultural or other use, land under privately owned structures, medical clinics operated by a private entity, and school buildings that are no longer used for governmental purposes. So I hear that the airport operators want to delete all that language, but they're going way beyond airports. Discussion. Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I think one of the biggest ones there is also the land lease for agricultural use. And I wonder if the taxes on those lands will end up being more than we get on grazing fees in our leases.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. It'd be very interesting if they were. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would really suggest voting no on this. I think, like you said, it brings in all these new things. I don't understand if the airports are the concern, why we're going into other things, including housing, even those that have rents on them. I mean, that does not make sense to me. I mean, if there's a rent on housing that a public entity is providing, it should be charged property tax just like every single landlord in the state. So I'd vote no on this. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
So, Mr. Chairman, a number of these things are incorporated at the Natrona County International Airport. There is workforce housing on site that is rented. The medical clinic, I don't know if it's referring to hangar space, because we also have an operator for one of the helicopter and fixed wing emergency services. That's,
Are they for profit?
I couldn't answer that.
Okay.
So, but I will just say that this isn't just about Natrona County. And it's also your other small airports across the state, which may or may not be in your district, but Natrona County International Airport is in my district. So I'll die on the sword.
Okay. Anybody else? Call for the question on the first division, which is page 2, lines 20 through 23, and page 3, lines 1 through 4. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Okay, I think that has failed. Okay, the next one for the division would be page 3, lines 10 through 12. Page 3, lines 10 through 12 is governmental property that is held for sale or lease, including business parks and other economic development properties. So those are properties that are being held and to be sold to private entities, I would presume. So the argument is that those should be taxable. Discussion. Ready for the question? Go ahead, Representative Gray.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I definitely urge a no vote on this one too. I mean, again, this is competition with the private sector. I mean, I think we had this debate a lot. I think it's been pretty clear that the state legislature is okay with that, but it should be taxable. I mean, this is a whole different angle here. I mean, just from a competition perspective. I think this really opens up a whole, if you remove this, it opens up a lot of things. So I'd vote no on this. Thank you.
Anybody want to speak to it? Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And not too much here, just very quickly. I think we have a key skill in every county. It's called the assessor. They're elected, they're trained, they're certified, they know what they're doing, And they're on job, in office, to take care of us and make sure the right things happen. And I don't think we have to redefine everything in every county, so we have, every county is exactly the same. We're not made that way, so I urge a no vote.
Okay. Anybody else? Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, I do think D by itself qualifies every lot of state trust land that we allow for lease. I think this alone means every lot of state trust land will be taxable, and then we'll just pay every county and every municipality some property tax where we have state trust lands. So if that's something that the state wants, I think by all means keep it in. I do want to make sure that we're not going to increase our state budget by a whole bunch because we're going to have to start paying some tax bills.
Representative Yen, I think you might be right the way this reads, but certainly it's an easy fix to say non-state trust land that is held for sale or lease. I mean,
So, Mr. Chairman, then I guess my question would be, why are we holding the state to a different standard than our town and counties on what they're allowed to do with their lands?
Representative Yen, I'm not arguing with you necessarily on it, but I think folks may find a difference in the fact that our trust lands are part of our active mission, and they were given to fund stuff for the state of Wyoming for the education. So with respect to the amendment proposed on the table, is there any more discussion? So, and we can come back and modify that later if you want, or during the session. But so page 3, lines 10 through 12, the proposal is to delete them. Delete that entirely. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. That has failed. The next part of the division is page 3, line 16. It would be after the word courthouses, and this is what property is for administrative use. This would be non-taxable property, and it's adding housing for employees. Representative Gray.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd urge a no. I mean, I think we've already taken the stand that we're not gonna, that will be taxable. And so now if we put that in, it's in there, it would be in conflict with the decision made earlier.
Okay, anybody else? Ready for the question? All those in favor of the amendment as proposed to insert housing for employees as an administrative use signify by saying aye. Any opposed? No. No. So that has failed. So we're bound to the insertion on page 3, line 18, which would be a new paragraph and renumber as necessary. Aviation facilities means real property improvements owned. I think there should be a by there, if you guys don't mind, owned by municipalities, counties, joint powers boards, special district airport boards, either singly or jointly for the purposes of exercising powers in WS 10.5.101. I assume, Josh, what's 10.5.101? That's airport statute? Okay, you feel it's in. Anybody on this one? Anyone want to speak for or against? Ready for the question? Josh, did you find it?
So, Mr. Chairman, 10.5.101 is powers of municipalities and counties generally. And I would guess there's something in there about operating an airport.
It must cover joint powers boards somehow.
Yeah, I believe that's true, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So this is aviation facilities mean real property improvements owned by these entities for the purposes of having exercising powers under the municipal statute, I think is what that says. But it's,
Mr. Chairman, wouldn't that be everything then? I mean, you're
well, it says
defining
aviation facilities means this under the Municipal Powers Act. It doesn't say everything under the Municipal Powers Act. Is that right, Josh? Have I got that right? If you look at the amendment.
So, Mr. Chairman, the amendment would read, aviation facilities means real property improvements owned by municipalities, counties, joint powers boards, special districts, airport boards, either singly or jointly for the purposes of exercising powers in 10.5.101. 10.5.101 is powers of municipalities and counties generally.
Sounds a little broad.
It does sound broad, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
So I think, Mr. Chairman, what the airport operators are trying to get to is some semblance. They've got requirements under FAA, as you heard, on some of the grants, which may not mean much. I bet it means a lot in Riverton to some of our municipal airports and county airports on federal funding. And so on grants and the rest of it, that the state doesn't really, they help them partner, the state, we do. But I think this one insertion would be a good move, and trying to get something so they can still get funding. Unless the state and the county assessors want to step forward and replace all of those grants, which in Natrona County is tens of millions for our airport.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. I don't think anybody wants to take money away from airports. I don't think we're trying to do that. We're just trying to get this narrowed down to where it works. And I believe Josh might have a better understanding of 10.5.101.
So,
Josh.
Mr. Chairman, so now as I look closer, while the title is very broad of it, it is specifically related to municipal and county airports.
Okay. So basically, we could say aviation facilities are administrative purpose of government. That's what it would come under if it would come on page 319. It'd say administrative use. Is that where we want it to go? How about the assessors? Any idea? Is that clarifying or not? Oh, that's a new definition, right, Josh? It's not under, okay, I stand corrected. It's a new definition. And then how is the aviation facilities used then? Is it used?
Mr. Chairman, it is used on page 5, lines 18 to 19 under the definition of transportation, as a list of one of the items that would be a governmental purpose.
So does that make this definition kind of circular?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would provide some detail on what is meant by aviation facility. If there was any confusion to that,
Okay.
that term is used in that section.
So it all would come under Romanet 23 on page 5, which is transportation. And that's a list of things. Help me with this, Josh.
So, Mr. Chairman, they're looking to add a new definition after administrative use and renumber.
Yep.
So it'd be a new number 20 that would define aviation facilities, I guess, then for the purpose of what that would mean in the definition of transportation.
And all transportation would not be taxed.
And transportation is not taxed. It would be a governmental purpose.
Okay. Is everybody okay with that? They understand it anyway? Discussion? Ready for the question? So it expands the definition of aviation facilities on line 18 and 19 on page 5 under transportation as being non-taxable things. And it would expand that.
Would it be best just to put it here rather than renumber everything?
Yeah, I think that might be a suggestion. Josh, Senator Pappas is asking if we should add it under 24. Or you would have leeway to put it wherever you wanted,
Mr.
right?
Chairman, I think they put it where they did just to follow alphabetical order. So the rest of these after the initial one do go in alphabetical order. Another alternative would be to actually put it in the definition of transportation and say, as used in this paragraph, aviation facilities means.
Do you guys want to give leeway to Josh to make it clear? Okay. Further discussion? All those in favor of this amendment to define aviation facilities signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? I think that's carried. So any other amendments on the bill? Who's that? Representative Yen.
Mr. Chairman, I think there are still quite a few conflicts in multiple places in this bill where things fall under not exempt that would also qualify under exempt in a different definition. And I also think the biggest egg is still the state trust lands. And I think trying to come up with an amendment here is not great, but I also think that that probably means the fact that we didn't find this until the last meeting is that there are probably other eggs hiding under that broader category of governmental property that is used for certain items. And, I think as such, I'd like to move to table this bill because I don't think it's really quite ready for the session. So I'll make that motion.
I can't remember, you need a second to table? I think you do. So is there a second for the motion to table? Second. Got a second? Okay, all those in favor of the motion to table, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no?
No.
No. I'd like to see a show of hands. All those in favor of tabling, raise your hand. It's like it's tabled, so, all right. Could have done that earlier. Thank you very much. All right, well, the next bill for our consideration, shall we take come back at 4 o'clock? Let's take 15 minutes, everybody.
So I have a shuttle that I have to catch at 5 o'clock.
Good.
I might leave at like 4:30.
Haven't done yet? Yeah. By the way, I wanted to thank you for this morning's.
I'll leave
So Josh, will you do this bill? Okay. Josh, there are more copies up here. Harshman had some copies. So if anybody needs more copies of Harshman's amendment, it's right here. It's not in color, but it's here. Lots of them. All right, let's try to call it back to order. So I know people want to get on the road. The next bill for our consideration is 23 LSO 65, skill-based amusement games opt-out. Josh, you want to take us through this one? And everybody, we do have extra copies of a proposed amendment from Co-Chairman Harshman. So go ahead, Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh Anderson, LSO. So if you remember, back at our April meeting, the Gaming Commission presented to the committee, and out of that discussion, we had two bills. The first was skill-based amusement games, authorized locations. That bill we looked at the last meeting, and that was sponsored by the committee. And then this bill was also requested at that time, which was to provide a county opt-out of skill-based amusement games. We looked at this bill at our last meeting, and then the request was to bring it back to this meeting and include also an opt-out for municipalities. So, Mr. Chairman, just that's basically what the bill does. It allows either a county or a city or town to submit to the voters a question of whether to opt out of skill-based amusement games. If that is approved, then no new skill-based amusement games will be authorized. And on subsection E, if there are existing games at the time in that county, city, or town, and the games are prohibited, those games are allowed to continue to be operated for 5 years if the operator is otherwise lawfully operating those games. And that's essentially the bill, Mr. Chairman. I'd take any questions.
Questions for Mr. Anderson? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is not clear to me on page 2, line 18, what anything means from page 2, line 18 to the end of the subsection. So through page 3, line 11. So can you take it through each sentence? I mean,
Sure.
I understand the first two, but then there's these series of if statements. I think there's 4 of them, or maybe it's 3, and I don't understand any of them.
Okay, sure, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead,
So
Josh.
the first sentence, Mr. Chairman, is if voters in the city or county have prohibited skill-based amusement games, games may be authorized if a question is submitted to the voters in that city, county, city, or town to authorize the game. So basically, it just provides the reverse, that if they've previously prohibited the games under this section, they could resubmit that question to the vote to reauthorize those games. The next sentence, Mr. Chairman, starting at the bottom of page 2, this is if the games had been prohibited county-wide, this would provide a process for a city in that county to put a vote to the voters to authorize games within that city that's in the county. So they're prohibited countywide. City, one of the cities in the county later wants to approve them, they could do so. And then the next sentence would be that if a city has prohibited them, the county could potentially have a vote to prohibit them county-wide, with the caveat that if that election fails, it would not affect the the vote that had previously occurred in that city or town. So just
Got it?
an interaction of the cities and counties, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Anderson? Anybody else? Thanks, Mr. Anderson. Who would like to testify on this bill? Who would like to go first? Mr. Downing, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Case and members of committee. Jonathan Downing on behalf of Cowboy Skill and Pace-O-Matic. We operate skill-based amusement games in Wyoming throughout 200 Wyoming small businesses and fraternal organizations like American Legions, VFWs, bars, some restaurants, over 21 areas primarily in truck driving lounges, and then Mr. Clements with Patriot Games, he has some in smoke shops as well as some other locations, different company from ours. I'm also joined by Catherine Wilkinson, who's representing Cowboy Skill and Pace-O-Matic. And so conscious, happy Thanksgiving. And this is the last bill before you probably go home or go see relatives. And so for those of you that are moving on from the process, just want to say thank you for your service to Wyoming. We've appreciated it all. Sometimes we've not agreed on things, other times we have. And so that's the great part about working in Wyoming. And I'm also looking at this amendment, so apologies for catching up on that lengthy amendment that might be proposed later. Since skill games were codified by the Wyoming legislature back in 2020, there have been several opportunities by previous legislatures to change the makeup. There have been some discussions about should skill games still continue to be available to Wyoming businesses and the like. And as we're almost through year 3, as we have, as an industry, generated about just by the end of the year, it should be around $10 million in revenues and fees paid to the state of Wyoming, right at that ballpark. They've been generated by skill games that pay 20% taxes to the state of Wyoming. Those taxes go to schools, they go to the Gaming Commission for Administration, and they also go to local governments. And the main piece with this bill, as far as looking at it at this point in time, I think it was telling when one of the assessors earlier today was talking about having the uniformity of statewide regulation, and compliments to Gaming Commission staff as far as standing up that agency that had previously been parimutuel, but now is regulating a number of other gaming interests. And as we've stood it up, I'd say the biggest concern right now is that if you go for an opt-out at a local government level, that can change with time. It can change just as we see elections come and go, as we see these cycles of the pendulum swing back and forth. That creates a lot of uncertainty for those small Wyoming businesses. And when we look at those businesses, skill games have served as a source of revenue. It's not the destination. It's mainly one of those where it's served as supplemental income. Skill games with the sideboards that we'd asked, and this was in the context of asking for responsible regulation, mainly 4 games per location max, that you can only play $3 per play, and the max win is $3,000 per win. And in those areas, there was a lot of science behind why do you do $3 per play? Why do you do 3,000 max win? And at the end of the day, ultimately, skill games are designed to be a game of entertainment and amusement that still allows somebody who's exercising skill to win every time. And so that, having that high standard there, that's the foundation by which the industry came into Wyoming and asked for regulation. And so as we enter the 2023 session, as this is the last piece on the agenda of the last meeting of Revenue Committee, we would just ask that we still stick with the sideboards bill that we had discussed earlier this session during the interim. But at this stage, please oppose this bill. Catherine, I don't know if you have anything else to add?
Ms. Wilkinson? welcome.
Any,
How about you, sir?
Ryan Clement with Patriot Contests and Games, also represent Smoker Friendly, and we have several bars across the state. I would just reiterate and support exactly what Jonathan just said, and urge you guys to support this bill. It took us a long time getting here to oppose the bill.
It's all the same to us, don't
Oppose
worry.
the bill. It took us a long time to get here. And for us running a small business personally with games in our bar, that ultimately we had to close for some period of time because our games initially were denied. This is a boon for small business. This is a small business industry, and it really has helped small business survive in places they otherwise wouldn't have during COVID and during pandemic times. So again, urge you to oppose this bill.
Okay. Questions for our panel? Any questions? Thanks, you guys. Anything else to add?
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, if we do end up working the amendment for the legislation, as far as this piece, we're still absorbing it. It's pretty extensive, and so once we take a look at it a little bit later, if that ends up getting worked, then we might have some comments a little bit later, if that's okay.
Yeah, just thank you very much for that. That was something that Co-Chairman Harshman was seeking. Probably be looking for someone to try to introduce that amendment. He had a backup plan, which was just to amend the title, so we might discuss this down the road. So that's the short version and the long version. So just letting you know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Stand by. Okay. Welcome, Mr. Agopian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nick Agopian, today representing Bankshot LLC and SNC Vending. For purposes of skills games, Bankshot is a software vendor, software manufacturer. SNC Vending has the license to vend and provide their product in Wyoming, and they are a licensed vendor by the commission. Today I'm here in front of you for 23 LSO 0065 and stand opposed to both the bill in its current form and the amendment as presented this afternoon to us in paper form. And I thank the chairman for sharing that with us. Our opposition, we haven't heard, I stand in opposition, but I don't have anything to respond to. There hasn't been any testimony that suggests a problem is occurring that would require a solution that's being presented on the paper in front of you today. I think that's a very big component. We haven't seen issues arising at the commission. We're not seeing hearings where individuals are being brought and statutory holes are causing individuals acting inappropriately to be let go. So I'm not hearing any major issues that are occurring. All of this is occurring under the current landscape of we still don't have rules in place. Now, the commission and its staff has worked very hard. We're very, very close to having skills games rules in place that would allow for the application of new operators or the locations and new vendors, the folks bringing the games in. But we have been on pause. And as a result of that, we're living in a world where we believe we're on track for about 30% less revenue this year than last year. And 20% of that is the state's take. And so we're seeing declining revenue as we've been waiting. Don't believe that this bill would certainly help. And while I did speak in opposition to the bill that this committee has agreed to sponsor, limiting locations to liquor stores and to truck stops, the future of that bill does seem fairly bright. And I do believe that that will provide an additional layer of community oversight through those specific licenses, either at the county or the municipal level. With that, I could go into the bill, but I think one major issue I see with this bill as it envisions a vote of the people, it has no sideboards on when that vote would occur, how many of those votes could occur in a calendar year. If a vote goes up, when is the next time you could put on the ballot a vote to try and an opposition vote? So there's a handful of things in this bill that would need more attention. This topic, if the committee recalls, was it wasn't tabled formally, but it was not discussed at the second meeting. So here we are, and we still stand in opposition, and certainly in opposition on its face to the amendment that was presented. I haven't had a chance to visit with my clients for a formal position, but I think just identifying in that amendment the need to change the title when it wasn't noticed that way raises some concern for me as our ability to be prepared for this meeting. So I'm not prepared to speak to that amendment, but I don't believe we would find our way to supporting it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for any questions, and I certainly appreciate this committee's time ahead of the holiday.
Okay, questions from Mr. Agopian? Any questions? Nobody? Okay, thank you, Mr. Agopian. Mr. Mosier. Seems like I haven't heard from you in a long time.
Chairman Case, members of the committee, Mike Mosier, Wyoming State Liquor Association. Since you've already had to hear me whine about this bill once, I'll try to keep from being too redundant. We oppose this bill. The answer that you're looking for was passed before. As Mr. Downing mentioned, the sideboards address unparalleled growth or uncontrolled growth when expansion happens. Bear in mind that the only concern I've heard from people around the state with expansion of gaming is not these machines. We have not increased the number of skill games in several years. In fact, the number has shrunk. These are not the places with big signs that say gamble here or gaming here. They're for machines tucked away in the back of a bar or restaurant. They're for our clientele. This is not about big businesses. This is about small businesses, clubs, fraternal organizations. And so I think it's important to remember what the focus may be, but this is not where the focus is ending up in this particular bill. It's kind of interesting because, after we went through COVID, it was like we have it made in the shade. Right now, on-premise is having a really tough time. On-premises in bars, restaurants, clubs. Combination of the recession, fears of a recession, food and liquor costs have been spiking, and which is reflected on our customers, and labor shortages and higher cost of labor. These skill games are an essential component to a lot of these businesses hanging on through times like this. And this time there's no federal money helping out. And so this is a very important time to have that source of revenue for these businesses that have grown to have that revenue coming in. We wouldn't talk about, and I hope we wouldn't talk about, I don't know much about the amendment, but from what I hear, I don't think it's a very good idea either. But once you have a type of gaming, you want to build sideboards, but you don't want to just shut the door and go retroactive on small businesses, which is what this is about. Like I said, the concern about gaming, I understand. I don't want gaming, I don't want casinos on every corner. But in this case, the people I represent aren't the skill games. They're the little businesses that have them and in your community and whose survival is so dependent on this. And so I would ask committee that you oppose this bill. It would pick winners and losers by county lines, which we do not want either. And so with that committee, I will take any questions. And those of you who aren't going to be back, you will be missed, and it's been a lot of fun. And best of luck to you and happy Thanksgiving.
Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mosier, and I'm not weighing in on any, my opinion on anything. I just want to ask you because on gaming, I don't game so that much. So I'm seeing a lot of these, they're called derby clubs pop up. Basically, they converted a place I like to eat at, Keg and Cork. Basically got 10 tables now for dining, and it's all gaming, basically. I mean, it's pretty much been converted. I shouldn't say that. It's like 10 tables and then it's gaming. And I mean, to me, that's skill gaming, right? So it's hard for me to believe that it's being dropped down. What is that? Because I'm getting a lot of calls about that. What is authorizing that?
Mr. Mosier.
Representative Gray, and we're certainly, I mean, it's legal and people are playing them, but that's historic horse racing, as I understand, and not skill games. Skill games are limited to 4 per establishment. And so I don't know. I know of one establishment in Cheyenne where you even know that they have skill games outside the building and they don't have a liquor license. Normally, you wouldn't even know they had them unless you went inside the bar. But if it's one I'm thinking of, it's historic horse racing.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you give me a little, I do want to ask about that because I was joking with somebody. I'm like, I don't see any historic horse racing. I was just looking around. I mean, at the one I went to, I mean, maybe this isn't your area, but historic horse racing is historic horse racing. I mean, it's an actual, there's a definition to it. I mean, it was mostly weird, different games that had nothing to do with looking at an old horse race, because I looked at every single machine. I mean, what is the definition of historic horse racing in statute? Because my understanding of what it is isn't what I'm seeing when I was in one of the derby clubs. Thank you.
Mr. Mosher, does it involve very old horses?
Mr. Chairman, you gave me hope for my retirement shot. Representative Gray, that is not my area of expertise. There are others in the room that could answer that a lot better. In the old footprints, when it was first legalized, they were in liquor establishments, and now they've become more the focus of those businesses, and I think that's what your calls are based on, but those are not skill games. Now, some of them are members of ours, and we support what they do, but that's not what this is addressing.
Go ahead.
I want to make one comment, Mr. Chairman, which is that when I look up historic horse racing, it says that basically they run old races. And you look at a racing forum, I've never done it, and I haven't seen a single machine in some of these establishments that are doing that. So I would really like to understand that a little bit, but I understand it's not your area of expertise, so maybe it's afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree, Representative Gray, that I don't know much about them either because I have the attention span of a third grader, and sitting down and playing a game bores me to death. So, but there are people in this room that can help.
Including from the commission, so yeah. All right, any other questions for Mr. Mosher? Anybody else? Thank
Happy
you, Mr.
Thanksgiving
Mosher.
Committee.
Who else would like to testify on this bill? Mr. Fraser, good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities, and I guess I'm the odd man out today. While I'm not sure in which cases exactly this may be exercised, we do, of course, support local decision-making, and in this case, where a local governing body might opt out of these skill-based games, we of course support their right to do so. I'm not prepared to get in too deep into the tall grass on this bill, but I would certainly take any questions that the body has.
Yeah, Mr. Henderson, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as a representative of the municipalities, if looking ahead, if this were to move forward and pass, and a municipality opts out, should they also opt out of any revenue associated with gaming?
Mr. Fraser.
Well, ideally, you'd have your cake and eat it too, right? Through the chair, but I'm just teasing.
I don't think he heard you.
Oh, I made a bad joke about having our cake and eating it too, but I was just kidding. But I was just kidding about that. No, I think it's fair that, and interestingly, I was the city manager of the only city in the state of Nevada that didn't have gaming. And so it's interesting that you asked me that question. In that case, we did. It was interesting because in that case, we actually did receive our share of the state's revenue. But and that was an odd relic of a former time when the city I managed, Boulder City, was actually a federal reservation to build the Hoover Dam, and at that time was dry and didn't allow gaming, and it never changed the gaming statute there. But I think it would certainly be fair that if someone opts out, that they're opting out, and take that into consideration.
Any other questions for Mr. Frazier? Anybody? Representative Sweeney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of my concerns is perfectly illustrated by Representative Gray's questions of Mike Mosier. And I think this bill in particular is without the amendment, which really confuses the issues. But the bill as it stands somebody's got to be responsible to get the education out there on what the folks are voting on. So Representative Gray brings up a very good point. What really is historical horse racing? What is skilled games? And this bill contemplates that you put it to the vote of the people. And so let's say the municipality opts out. It is in here, but it's complex. City of Casper decides to opt out because people didn't know what this actually says. So is the municipality also willing to try to educate what's historic horse racing, what people are voting on? At the same time, the loss of revenue to the city of Casper just on skilled games is, I think, going to end up being several $100,000. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, how you might educate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Chair. Thank you, Representative. You bring up a couple of good points. And one is that there are real restrictions on what a local governing body, what a local government can spend on an election. And under the statute, they can educate, but can't advocate. And so that's a line that our members toe pretty squarely. And in fact, that they're so careful about it that they really pull their punches even on the educational component because they don't want to get too close to that line. So I think you're going to see, I think you raise a good point that you're going to see a real challenge in getting the public educated on that. And I know this runs counter to what is said in these halls often, but I think this would be a case where it really should be the local governing body that would make that decision. And, or in other words, the voters' elected representatives who are elected not only to make those decisions, but are expected to be educated about those decisions. And that is something that the staff can spend time on, is educating the governing body. But again, it gets really murky when we talk about educating the general public on something that's going to be on the ballot. So I would recommend that if this moves forward, that we look at the governing body as who makes those decisions, the county commissioner or the city council, town board.
Representative Sweeney, can I ask you a question? Are you thinking that this is unclear whether it applies to skill-based amusement? I mean, it's under the commission authority 1125-301, and where it has skill-based amusement games operated in the state in accordance with the provisions of session laws shall be allowed to continue operation. So that's all about skill-based amusement, and the vote's all about skill-based amusement. Was your point that that's confusing? I certainly see how voters could have the same problem that Representative Gray has. It's a machine and you don't know what it does. Is that skill-based amusement that we're voting on, or is that historical horse racing? But I think this law is clear that this voting applies to skill-based amusement that would have been authorized by the commission. I don't think there's ambiguity about that, at least not yet. Can you help me? I'm kind of confused by your question.
So absolutely, the bill only deals with skill-based games. The amendment tries to bring in historic horse racing.
By your chairman, I might add.
But, so my point is, and the point of my question is, the educational piece, because I believe people are totally confused on the expansion of historic horse racing and the difference between that and skill-based amusement games. And so somebody's got to educate. If this goes to the vote of the people on this bill without the amendment, somebody's still going to have to educate the consumer of what they're voting on, what they're opting out is all I'm trying to point out. And I'm not saying that Representative Gray is ignorant on the fact, but I agree with him on the, there's a little ticker tape that you've got to look for on the historic horse racing that it's very confusing.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's confused by the fact, I hope we get the Gaming Commission up here, but confused by the fact that I'm not sure there's much historic horse racing going on at historic horse racing. I mean, I've always loved horse racing, and I don't see a single machine that does old horse racing races at the ones I've seen, so.
I think there's special places, and we're gonna hear from.
Yeah.
We'll get.
But it
that
adds to the
later.
confusion.
Yeah. Any other questions for Mr. Fraser? Representative Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So going back to your position and your network with the municipalities, are you hearing, have you heard from the memberships of the municipalities about any problems in the communities related to skill-based games?
Go ahead, Mr. Fraser, if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair to the representative, I wouldn't say, I couldn't say that I haven't heard of any problems. I can say that, which is the way you phrased your question, I can say I'm not hearing of widespread problems. It's not a topic high on our list.
It's not the same as dancing.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Could I follow up on that?
You bet.
Have you heard, the only complaints I've heard on now you, Representative Gray's got me confused. So, on skill-based games was in the early days with law enforcement having complaints. But after, the legislation was passed, we're moving forward with the Gaming Commission. Have you currently heard any complaints about opting in, opting out, as far as your membership of 99 municipalities?
Mr. Fraser.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not in terms of opting in, opting out, and mostly as you described, the early days is correct, but obviously there will always be some law enforcement involvement that will come along with this from time to time.
Anybody else for Mr. Fraser? Thanks a lot, Mr. Fraser.
Thank
Any
you.
chance we can get the commission up here to tell us if you got any historical horse racing out there? I'll bet the old horses are kept in a hangar at the airport and they're not taxed. I'm willing to bet on that. Hi, gentlemen. Sorry to drag you in, but thanks for being here, okay? Who would like to help us out?
I'll start off. Thank you, Senator Case, Chairman, committee members. My name's Charlie Moore. I'm the director of the Wyoming Gaming Commission. With me today, I have President Bob Davis.
How you doing?
And then also Special Agent Nick Laramendi with me today. As far as a position on the current bill, we don't necessarily have a position on this. We're neither speaking for nor against the bill. So I think at this point, we haven't had an opportunity to look at the amendments either, and they look fairly extensive. I think at this point, we would take questions.
That's great. It's okay. We're not trying to pin you down on the bill so much as there were some general questions. So Representative Gray.
I am, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am fielding some calls and seeing it personally. A lot of restaurants being converted into restaurant/gaming operations. One is the old Keg and Cork in Casper, which now is the Keg and Cork, but also a derby club. I just drove by one here in Cheyenne. Haven't walked in that one. I just want to understand what exactly is causing that expansion. Not that I'm weighing in one way or another on it, but I am curious because people have been talking about it and I've seen it myself, and that seems to be the most visible change, and it's quite visible recently. And when I walked around it, when I was at the Keg and Cork, reason why I thought it might have been a skill game is because I didn't see any historic horse racing. It looked to be all just kind of flashing things, and I didn't see any old horse. My understanding on historic horse racing is it's an old race, and with no identifiers, so you can't look it up on your phone. Actually, sounds kind of interesting. I've never seen one of those kiosks before though, and I didn't see that there. So if you could help me to understand what's happening around the state with that. Thanks.
More.
Chairman Case, Representative Gray, first and foremost, I would like to invite any one of you to come to our office. We have skill-based amusement games in the office. We also have historic horse racing games in the office. We're in Natrona County, we're in Casper, so you'd be more than welcome to come over anytime, and Mr. Laramendi can walk you through each and every one of those games. We have those in the office so we can do forensic inspections, reviews of those games, and make sure that they are compliant. To speak to some of your questions, the bill as presented is specifically a skill-based amusement game bill. What you're speaking of, Representative Gray, is historic racing locations around Natrona County. The location you're talking about, the Keg and Cork, is about a half a mile from my house as well. So I drive by multiple times, whether I'm going to Home Depot or whether we're going up to Menards or something like that in the area. But, the calls that I'm receiving are very similar to the calls that you're receiving as well. And part of that is in Natrona County, no different than probably Representative Sweeney, is our connectivity to the community. So our community leaders, the municipal level, at the county level, they know they can pick up the phone and call me anytime, 7 days a week, whatever, if they have questions. And a lot of their concerns are not so much the expansion, but having a seat at the table when some of this is going on, I think is what I'm hearing generally in Natrona County. Are there problems? Are there issues that we've identified? I would say no. We haven't had any negative issues with that. So what I may ask, if you don't mind, is the definition of historic horse racing. Mr. Laramendi can read that if you'd like us to. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Mr. Laramendi. Thank you.
Mr. Laramendi, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We have nothing to hide.
All right. Mr. Chair, Representative Gray. So in the statute, the definition of, and I'm just going to read part of it. It says the commission may authorize and promulgate rules providing for pari-mutuel wagering on events that have previously occurred, utilizing an electronic system or device that affords an opportunity for the exercise of skill or judgment where the outcome is not completely controlled by chance alone. That's the definition. And I can give you kind of a quick overview of the terminals. Historic horse racing terminals can operate two separate ways. The most common way, when you go into a location and you see somebody playing it, they hit the spin button. When they hit the spin button, what the system does is it selects the race cards, and it can be anywhere from 3 to 12 different races, all combined. And if they just hit the spin button, it selects either the morning line odds for the day that race was ran or the post time odds, depending on which system they're working on. But you can go into every one of those machines and you can handicap that machine. So if you click the information button and click on handicap, it'll pull up all the races that are going to be run. It'll show you all the horses that are going to be running, and then it'll give you stats for each one of those. And you can go in and you can manually handicap every one of those and make your own selections, and then hit spin, and then you see the fancy little eye candy. That's what we call it in our office, is the eye candy, and it just goes based on the races. Also, if you look at those locations when they hit the spin, if you look at the top of the screen on every one, you will see the races running across the top of the screen. It only lasts for maybe 3 to 5 seconds, but you'll see the ending of every race card that machine pulled to run for that spin. I hope that helps.
We good? Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have a couple of things. I've noticed that we have Representative-elect Davis. We maybe ought to notice that publicly. And then I had a
I'm so
couple of
sorry for you.
questions. So to Director Moore, as I look at this bill, and gaming is one of the very few things that I enjoy about the legislatures, because one side of me wants to vote no, and the other side. But it looks like this is maybe a bill looking for a problem. I mean, are you hearing from the public that they're wanting to vote on this? I mean, I'm all for the public voting and having a say if their community or county doesn't want to have that. But are you seeing any people out there saying, boy, I wish we could vote on this? We'd sure like to kick this out of our county, or are we having problems that are rising to?
Director Moore.
Chairman Case, Representative Jennings, we're not getting a lot of calls, no. And again, primarily the calls that we're receiving are from Natrona County and from our local municipality. We are seeing a relatively, and this is not related to skill games. This is related more to the parimutuel side in Natrona County with some of the expansions. But, I'm somewhat similar to you as far as gaming goes. You look at this and where is it going? And I've said to this committee, and I've also said this to Appropriations Committee, and this discussion is good. We need to have these discussions. What do you want Wyoming to look like? And I think maybe some of, and I'm guessing, if you don't mind, make kind of a logical guess here at this point. The opt-in, the opt-out. Well, that is language that we have opt-in language with parimutuel. So I think potentially what's happening is people are being encouraged to have this parity across both entities, to where opt-in over here. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, kind of a situation. So maybe that's where some of this has started. I do think that some of the sideboards that have been presented in earlier meetings here in this committee are going to be helpful. But to your point, we're not seeing a lot of statewide concerns with this, other than Natrona County.
Okay. Anybody else? Senator Schuler.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My question, actually a couple of them, but I'll try to put them all in one big, long question. In my area, of course, we have both. We have historic and we have the skill base, and we have live horse racing. We get a lot of money that comes across the border for all of those. But I would say this, that the historic horse racing, which is not, this bill doesn't attempt to talk about, is more, I think I would see more of the out-of-towners, out-of-staters that play that. They come over for the horse races and then they play. But I mean, there are some locals also that take advantage of it. But our skill-based folks are more of the local folks that go into a bar or a VFW or American Legion, whatever, and grab dinner, and then they might go in the back room and play. I have not heard one issue. And I do quite often go around and check, not only with our law enforcement, but with our folks that are the vendors, the folks that, have these establishments. We haven't had one issue. And we do get a lot of folks that come over from across the way. So I kind of look at this bill as like the horse is already out of the barn. And I know our county would not vote for it. I guarantee you they wouldn't. because the amount of money that helps our community, and not only helps our community, but our state, props up restaurants and hotels and that sort of thing. It's pretty unbelievable, actually. And and I've always been one of those that, I've never played one of these, so I couldn't tell you. I mean, I know different machines are in different places, but I couldn't even turn on an Xbox, so I have no idea how these even work. But I just think this bill is ill thought out. I don't think it's something we need. The only question I have had between the two gaming situations is, will they ever expand skill base? Because, right now, historic racing doesn't have a cap on it. And that's the only question I've been asked. And I would like to ask that to you right now. Thank you.
Director Moore.
Chairman Case, Senator Schuler, again, thank you. The skill-based amusement game rules are in public comment currently. They will be out of public comment December 8th. Depending on the comments that we receive and the indications we are getting at this point, the industry is good with those rules. Those rules will then be, hopefully, my timeline, which depends on a lot of little things, but I would like to say that we will have our final adoption from the commission prior to Christmas. Then those will be submitted, obviously, to LSO and then back towards the governor's office. LSO and management council or management committee, I think, would review those. LSO will review those rules and return those back to the governor and DAG and so on and so forth. And then the governor will have his period of time. So we're looking at a March to have those. And then at that point, that gives us clear guidance. That gives the vendors, the operators, everyone clear guidance to move forward and expand upon that.
Okay. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, have you heard anything from any counties that have opted in with the historic horse racing already about maybe wanting a little bit more control, that they didn't want a blanket opt-in, that they didn't want the facilities popping up next to schools, they wanted maybe a little bit more control? So in our community, we have a new one coming in that I'm sure you're aware of. They bought the old Sears facility. It's a very large building. It's basically a warehouse. They share the parking lot with Ace Hardware. So they have that advantage of abundant parking, a huge, basically, warehouse on a main road. Do you think that that's really what the city had in mind when they were opting in on something like this? Or do you think that there's going to be, coming up as this happens more often, do you think that they're going to want more control? And I realize this bill doesn't address that, but the amendment does. So thank you.
Director Moore.
Chairman Case, Representative Baker, great question. I think it is a concern, where do any of these locations, should they be close to a school? Should they be close to, absolutely not. Should they be close to a church? My feeling is absolutely not. We don't have that authority at this point, or at least we don't believe we have that authority to restrict that under our current statutes. To your point, when they go to the county to seek their approval, they submit a plan to your county commissioners and they review that plan and look at that. And so I'm guessing when they sought the county approval in Sweetwater County, that there was, they understood exactly what they were looking for or voting for, excuse me. But maybe that goes to some of the education that we've talked about, whether it's our voters, whether it's our people. I believe we have in the House this year, 50 or 60 new members. I'm not sure if that's the correct number, but education every day to everybody. And we're trying to, our website has some very good educational materials. We have a lot of information out there that we can share with people. And I think it comes right back to that education.
I don't think there's 60 members, but there are 60 that act like new members. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up. I understand in the county, but this facility is going in at the city, and the city had no oversight in this. So that's really what my question is at a locality level, are we going to start to see this happen more often? Is the city of Casper going to express concern more often that the county is approving something? Thank you.
Chairman Case and Representative Baker, you have your local control there already with your Planning and Zoning Commission. They have all the power that allows this to happen. They have to go before them in any community if you're going to put in something like this. So you already have a local control involved in there.
Representative Baker?
Thank you, and I appreciate that. But oftentimes, my wife is a planning and zoning commissioner for the city of Green River. Oftentimes, they're hamstrung by the law. They can't, if it's a commercial use, then it's a commercial use that they've identified. They're not going to say, hey, we don't like this commercial use, but we like this one. They're going to say it's a commercial use. We're going to, offer that authorization. So I'm wondering, is this use going to be considered different in the future? And are municipalities going to start to be concerned that counties are approving things? Thank you.
Back to you, Commissioner Davis.
Representative Baker, what my understanding of that is that they have public hearings also to voice any concerns before the permits are issued on that zoning change. Whether it be in the commercial, there's still a public hearing or question brought forth, at least in Carbon County it is. And then I have a couple other points.
Go ahead, Commissioner Davis.
If that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a difference between the OTBs. They are already permitted by the counties. They can't operate in a county without a county
And OTB
permit.
means?
The off-track betting,
Thank you.
historical horse racing. Okay, and then the games of skill are not. They don't have that requirement. And then the other thing to Representative Gray is you're probably seeing expansion on OTBs because there are now 3 permittees in the state of Wyoming. Instead, previously, there were only 2. So they're trying to get their piece of the action also. That's why you're seeing the Derby Club pop up. Okay.
Okay, anybody else? Questions for these gentlemen? Any questions? Stay close. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Who else would like to testify to the committee? Do we have somebody online? Would that be right? Ms. Schrainer, should we have your online person testify? Can we bring in, and what's their name? Can we bring in Mr. Ridgway?
Mr. Chairman, members of
ahead.
the committee, Mary Ann Shaner, on behalf of 307 Horse Racing, I turn it over to Kyle Ridgway, the Vice President.
Mr. Ridgway, welcome. You've got the best counsel in the state right here.
Hey, thank you very much. She's a law school classmate of mine, so I trust her very much, Mr. Chairman.
One time I got sued by somebody and she actually defended me. So, and she won. So I'll just tell you that. Okay. Go ahead, sir.
I'm testifying from Casper. I appreciate you all allowing me to testify virtually. We've got a newborn and we didn't know that HHR was something that was going to be on the table here. So I appreciate everybody giving us some levity to testify here. There's a few things and I'll keep it quick because I know that's it's the end of the day related to this bill. And I just specifically want to talk about the amendment as opposed to the skill games part of this. I want to talk specifically about HHR. My testimony will mostly be educational about what it takes to actually permit one of these facilities. So I'm the vice president of 307 Horse Racing. Our corporate headquarters is based in Casper. We run live races in Gillette. It's the only Wyoming owned and operated 100% operator of HHR. We are the new operator. We are the ones that operate the Derby clubs. For those of you that are in Natrona County, I've talked to Ms. Shaner and we would love to host the entire Natrona County delegation at any of our facilities to explain our business. But what I will explain is, so first of all, we had to have a gaming license to even be involved in the industry. The gaming license requires us to run 16 days of live horse races in Campbell County at this point, which we run at the Camplex. That costs us anywhere from $1.5 million to $2 million a year just to put on decent races first. Second, to open an OTB, under Wyoming statute, the first thing that has to happen is there has to already be an election in the county that says parimutuel wagering is allowed in the county. So under the existing statutory framework, counties already have to opt in. Converse County just had an election in November, and theirs just passed. Park County had an election a couple of years ago and it failed. So as to our industry and HHR, there already is an opt-in election process. After there's an election, you have to present to the county commissioners and get a resolution authorizing you to open a location. In addition to that, every municipality has different zoning rules. For example, in Rollins and Cheyenne, for us to open our facilities there, we had to obtain special use permits. Particularly for Casper, I've had multiple meetings with the city manager there, Carter Napier, and I've talked to city council members about they should update their zoning rules to require special use permits. And that would solve this issue without any statutory change. The biggest issue, particularly in Natrona County, is that the other operators obtained what I call blanket approvals from the county a number of years ago that essentially gave them the ability to open locations in the county without having to come back to the county commissioners ever. Our policy as a company has always been to get site-specific approvals. If there was anything that anybody wanted to have a conversation about, my 2 cents would be to have site-specific approvals from the counties. But again, that's a question of, is that a county policy-making decision, or is that something the legislature should actually involve itself in? So with regard to WHAM's position with local control, there's plenty of local control related to ordinances from the municipalities. There are a number of municipalities that have zoning. We're going through a zoning process in Torrington, Wyoming right now to open one of our locations. After we get zoning approval, you still potentially have liquor license oversight in these facilities. Then you go to the Wyoming Gaming Commission and have to get approval from them. And I would recommend that any of you watch the most recent Gaming Commission hearing related to some additional Casper locations to see what the Gaming Commission did with the expansion of HHR terminals in what they call mini sites. So from our perspective, to keep it simple, we don't believe that HHR, in terms of an opt-in, opt-out mechanism, needs to be done. It's redundant with the existing statutory framework. There are a number of mechanisms in place for local control to exist, from zoning to county approval to gaming commission. And as I said when I testified to joint appropriations, if there are things that people want to do on the margins with this industry to ensure that there's no blanket approvals, that's a simple fix to a problem. But you have multiple layers of oversight here at our facilities, and I'm happy. We've worked very hard to try to educate the public as best as we can. As many of you know, that's not the easiest thing to do. For both of our facilities in Casper, we put out really long articles about how this is related to horse racing. So anyway, with regard to the bill, we oppose the proposed amendment only because my position is it's redundant from the existing statutory framework. There already is an opt-in, there already is local control in this industry, and it's incredibly highly regulated. I'll stand for any questions that anybody has about our business or anything else.
Thank you very much. Any questions? We've got one, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ridgway, and appreciate you laying that out, because I've just been getting a lot of questions in Casper, and it's just new, and people have questions on that, and so appreciate you laying it out. So my one question was, when did Natrona opt into this? Because I'm not recalling that. I'm just curious. Do you know the year we did that?
Mr. Ridgway, if you can.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I believe the issue here is that this is all under the parimutuel wagering statute. So there were elections that occurred to allow for live horse racing in Natrona County a while ago. I want to say it would have been in the 70s or 80s when the election occurred that allowed for parimutuel wagering. And then under the existing statutory framework, historic horse racing is defined as parimutuel wagering. At least that's my understanding. I don't know if they've had a new election since historic horse racing was allowed. I know other counties have had elections since historic horse racing was allowed, but for Natrona County, it was an opt-in prior to the amendment of the statute.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the suggestions of updating local codes to require site-specific special use permit. I appreciate that. I think that's a good avenue to start moving down for our local communities. But I don't share the comfort that you do that zoning laws are enough. The zoning laws really don't protect us from the things that we brought up here, the schools, the churches, the things like that. Do you have any policy within your company that is restrictive on where you'll place something, for example, next to a church or a daycare facility or a school, things like that? Are you sensitive to those things, or is it just based on zoning? Thank you.
Mr. Ridgway.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, I wouldn't say we have any formal policies other than common sense, because we all live in Wyoming and we live in these communities, and we don't want to put facilities near situations where they're going to be a nuisance per se. What I will say is there actually is an example of zoning preventing a facility from opening next to a church, daycare, counseling center, or school. Particularly in Cheyenne, a number of years ago, Wyoming Downs, one of our competitors, wanted to open a facility that was near some sort of social service organization. And when they went through their special use permit, there was enough feedback that the planning and zoning wasn't going to give approval, and so they withdrew their application. So zoning absolutely would allow you to prevent them placing them within a school or a church or whatever. That's the same thing that would apply to strip clubs or bars or other things that you could deem a nuisance. What I would say at the same time, though, is that we have a really good track record with these facilities, and as compared to a bar or a bar and grill, even these facilities have data that demonstrates there's less crime at the facilities, there's less police calls, and most of that's because every employee in these facilities has to be background checked and licensed by the Wyoming Gaming Commission. We have to security camera the entire facility. We're subject to random audit from the Gaming Commission, and they put some numbers out that they performed over 100 random inspections of HHR facilities in the last year. So I think zoning, I would just respectfully disagree that I think zoning is absolutely the tool that legally allows you to prevent siting near churches, schools, or what have you. Zoning already does that for a number of uses.
Representative Baker, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that and appreciate the disagreement. Would you be willing to spearhead, because there's only 3 of you, maybe an informal discussion where you guys maybe start to formulate a policy that maybe you guys are going to self-govern, away from schools and things like that? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Baker. Mr. Ridgway?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, what I would say is this is a super competitive industry. And the way that we entered the industry, I think, has made it where maybe all the operators don't necessarily work together the best as they might in others. But we are working together on forming an HHR association, and we've had conversations about some things like that. I mean, our policy has typically been if there's a liquor license located there, then we can go there, because you can only cite liquor licenses near so many different places because there's liquor license review there. So I would say I personally have tried in the last 2 years that I've been involved in this, in talking to WHAM and talking to county commissioners. I think I've been to 9 or 10 counties presenting to county commissioners in individual cities. And every time I've presented exactly like this, I don't have control over out-of-state competitors per se, but I would say our organization personally has worked very hard to try to make this industry fit what Wyoming wants. And I can't speak to the history that existed prior to our involvement, because we only got involved in 2021. But I can promise that we will work hard to be the standard bearer for appropriate regulation and for gaming to fit Wyoming and how it's supposed to work.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? I think you're off the hook. Thank you, Marion. Anybody else ready to testify in this bill? We got anybody else online? Nobody online? Anybody here? I'm not seeing any more public testimony. Committee, you've heard the testimony. What is your pleasure? What is your pleasure? I'm not seeing a motion on the bill. Not seeing a second on the bill, so I'd say the bill dies for lack of a motion. Anything else to come before the committee? I thought this might be a good time for an educational session that, it won't last but a couple hours. Ms. Choquette's been so good to wait through every meeting to make sure we stay till the very end in case something happens. But I do want to say to everybody, thank you for the service. This has not been my favorite committee to chair, I will say that. I think it's a difficult committee for everybody to be on, but I appreciate the way that we've treated each other and the way we worked through the issues. And so I'm very, very grateful to all of you for your service. Hope to see you soon, see you in different ways. And anybody want to say something before we wrap up? Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I'd like to thank both our co-chairs. I'm like you, it's not my favorite committee, but I think you guys have done an amazing job. Difficult committee to be on, and I kind of hope I'm not on it next year, but I mean, coming session, but if I am, oh well. But I'd also, again, just like to thank Representative Hallinan, Senator, I almost called you Senator, Representative Sweeney, Representative Baker, and also Representative Roscoe, and appreciate all the time and effort, and it's been great working with you, but thank you, Chairman.
Thank you all. I know Co-Chairman Harshman wishes he was here. We did buy cake, so that's awful something. Thank you all. And thanks to you folks out there that have followed us all the way. And it's not an easy committee. So thank you very much. And thanks especially to staff. Have a great Thanksgiving. And everybody be safe driving home, okay? I think we're adjourned. Are there any more?
Yep, I'm the last one.
It's cool.
Thanks, Kale.